"You do not look very well, my dear," my mother-in-law whispered, her smile wide and predatory as she pushed the crystal champagne flute toward me. What she did not know was that my career is built on calculating risk and spotting hidden patterns. I had already seen the white powder fall into that glass just seconds before. So when she turned to greet a passing guest, I made the quickest calculation of my life. I swapped our glasses. I watched her raise her flute toast to my new marriage and take a long, deep sip. And as the liquid touched her lips, I knew the real nightmare was just beginning. My name is Jessica. I am 30 years old, and for the past 8 years, I have worked as an actuary for a major commercial insurance firm in downtown Chicago. My daily professional life revolves around assessing risk, analyzing statistical probabilities, and predicting human behavior based on hard data. Numbers do not lie, but people lie constantly. I learned that lesson early in life. Growing up in the foster care system after losing my parents when I was very young, I had to learn how to read people quickly just to survive. You learn very fast who is safe to trust, who you need to avoid, and who is wearing a carefully constructed mask. Right now, I was sitting at the massive head table of my own wedding reception at one of the most exclusive luxury hotels in the city. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 200 wealthy guests. The room smelled of expensive orchids and roasted tenderloin. It looked like a perfect, pristine fairy tale. I was wearing a custom silk gown that cost more than the first car I ever bought. My new husband, David, was standing across the room laughing loudly with his groomsmen, completely oblivious to the tension radiating from my side of the room. On the surface, everything was absolutely flawless. But my internal risk assessment alarms were screaming at full volume. When David first proposed, my actuarial models had shown a stable low-risk projection. He was charming, employed in real estate, and offered the kind of deep-rooted family structure I had desperately craved since my time in foster care. I had willfully ignored the minor statistical outliers, the way he always deferred to his mother's aggressive opinions, the way his bank statements never quite aligned with his lavish spending habits, the way he sometimes looked at me not with love, but with a cold, calculating hunger. I had written those red flags off as standard marital friction. That was the greatest miscalculation of my entire professional and personal life. Standing at this head table, looking at the blinding diamonds on my finger, I realized I had not married into a family. I had married into a trap. Barbara, my new mother-in-law, was making her deliberate way toward me. For the past 2 years, Barbara had made it her personal mission to remind me of my place in their world. She was a woman born into generational wealth, always draped in designer clothes, and armed with a vocabulary specifically designed to cut people down to size. She had relentlessly mocked my working-class background. She had purposefully left brochures for high society etiquette classes on my dining room table. She had loudly and publicly questioned how a girl with no family name and a simple state college degree could possibly understand the complex nuances of their elite social circle. Yet as she approached the head table right now, she was smiling. It was not her usual polite forced smile that did not reach her eyes. It was radiant. It was entirely too eager. It was triumphant. My actuarial brain immediately started running the variables. The statistical probability of a sudden genuine shift in Barbara's core personality was practically zero. Human beings do not fundamentally change their behavior without a massive external catalyst. Her sudden warmth was a glaring anomaly. And an anomaly in my line of work always signals danger. She was holding 2 crystal champagne glasses, balancing them carefully. Her steps were measured and precise. She was watching me with a sharp, unblinking intensity that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand up straight. I did not look directly at her. I kept my eyes fixed on the crowded room, scanning the guests playing the role of the exhausted, blissfully happy bride. But my peripheral vision was entirely locked on her movements. A waiter walked past us, carrying a large, highly polished silver serving tray. The tray caught the light of the chandeliers, acting as a perfect curved mirror. In that fleeting, distorted reflection, I saw Barbara pause. She was standing just behind a massive, towering floral arrangement temporarily hidden from the rest of the room. I watched her thumb slip into her palm. I saw a tiny folded piece of paper snap open. And I saw a quick, practiced motion as she tapped a fine white powder directly into the glass in her left hand. The powder dissolved instantly into the bubbling champagne, disappearing without a single trace. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my face remained perfectly blank. I am an actuary. I do not succumb to panic. I analyze the incoming data and I execute a plan. She had intentionally poisoned the left glass. She resumed her walk toward me, holding the spiked left glass slightly closer to her body to protect it, keeping the clean right glass extended slightly forward as an offering. "Oh, Jessica," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sugary sweetness. "You look absolutely exhausted, my dear. I know this day has been so incredibly overwhelming for someone not used to such grand, elaborate events." I forced a soft smile, letting my shoulders slump slightly to play the part of the tired bride she expected me to be. "It has been a very long day, Barbara," I agreed, keeping my voice entirely steady. She leaned in close, her heavy, expensive floral perfume almost suffocating me. She placed the clean right glass down on the table first. Then she smoothly slid the spiked left glass directly in front of my hands. "You need to relax," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with a dark hidden anticipation. "Drink some champagne. It will help take the edge off. We are family now. We need to celebrate your new reality." I looked down at the spiked glass. The golden bubbles were rising to the surface perfectly normally. There was no odd discoloration. There was no strange chemical smell. It was a flawless, invisible execution. But I had the data. I knew the absolute truth of what was inside that crystal flute. Just as I reached out my hand toward the stem of the glass, fate intervened to give me my opening. A heavily intoxicated guest, an uncle on David's side of the family, stumbled backward into the table next to ours, violently knocking over a tall glass vase. Water and flowers crashed to the floor. "Oh my goodness," Barbara gasped, turning sharply to her right to avoid the splashing water and check the source of the commotion. Her attention was completely pulled away from our table for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds is an entire lifetime, when you know exactly what you need to do to survive. My hands moved faster than my conscious thought. I slid my spiked glass to the exact spot where her clean glass sat, and simultaneously pulled her clean glass directly in front of me. I adjusted the linen napkin slightly to make the placement look completely natural and undisturbed. The swap was utterly flawless, silent, and invisible. Barbara turned back around, dramatically brushing imaginary drops of water off her expensive silk gown, her face flushed with momentary irritation. Then her eyes darted immediately to the glass sitting in front of me. Seeing it exactly where she thought she had left it, her triumphant predatory smile returned in full force. She picked up the glass I had pushed toward her, the spiked glass. She raised it high, the intricate cut crystal catching the bright light of the overhead chandeliers. To Jessica, she announced, her voice carrying a sickening layer of fake joy that made my stomach turn. "To a long, manageable life with my son. May you get exactly what you deserve today." I recognized the double meaning in her words instantly. Manageable. She wanted me docile. She wanted me incapacitated. I raised my clean glass to meet hers. "To family," I replied softly, letting the word hang heavily in the air between us. I watched her intently over the rim of my glass. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She took a long, deep sip, swallowing a large portion of the champagne in one confident gulp. She wanted to make sure I drank mine, so she aggressively led by example. I brought my clean glass to my lips and took a slow sip of the crisp, cold champagne. It tasted like absolute victory. Barbara lowered her glass. Her eyes locked directly onto mine, waiting. She was waiting for me to falter, to show signs of sudden weakness, to succumb to whatever toxic chemical cocktail she had just knowingly ingested herself. I simply smiled back at her, radiating perfect calm and unwavering control. The timer in my head started ticking loudly. I did not know exactly what that white powder was. I did not know if it was a fast-acting sedative, a dangerous hallucinogen, or something far worse. But I knew one thing with absolute terrifying certainty. The wealthy, arrogant woman who had spent 2 years treating me like disposable garbage was about to have a very public, very uncontrollable physical reaction in front of 200 of her most important friends. And I was going to have a front row seat to her destruction. 10 minutes. In the world of risk assessment, 10 minutes can be the difference between a total catastrophic failure and a completely mitigated disaster. I spent those 10 minutes doing what I do best. I observed. I calculated. I waited. After the toast, Barbara had glided away from the head table with the smug satisfaction of a hunter who had just successfully set a lethal trap. She mingled with her wealthy friends, her diamond earrings catching the light, her laughter carrying over the gentle hum of the string quartet. I stayed at my seat for a few moments, playing the part of the demure blushing bride. I kept my posture relaxed. I kept my smile bright and unbothered. But my eyes never left my mother-in-law. I watched her every movement, analyzing the incoming physical data with cold actuarial precision. At minute 3, she touched her forehead. It was a subtle gesture, but I noticed the slight unsteadiness in her fingers. At minute 5, the string quartet transitioned into an upbeat jazz number, and the guests began moving toward the massive polished marble dance floor in the center of the ballroom. Barbara joined them, dragging a local socialite by the arm. At minute 7, her rhythm began to falter. The elegant practiced sway of her hips became rigid and disjointed. I stood up from the table, the heavy layers of my custom silk gown pooling around my feet. I walked slowly toward the edge of the dance floor, blending into the crowd of smiling faces. David was still on the other side of the room, holding a scotch glass, talking animatedly with his college fraternity brothers. He was not looking at his mother. He was not looking at me. He was waiting for a signal. I could feel it in my bones. At minute 8, I saw the first drop of sweat roll down the side of Barbara's face. It was entirely out of character for a woman who prided herself on absolute physical perfection. The ballroom was comfortably air-conditioned, but Barbara was beginning to shine with a frantic, unhealthy sheen. Her breathing became visible, her chest heaving under her expensive silk bodice. She pulled at the high collar of her dress as if it were suddenly choking her. The drug was taking hold. Whatever chemical compound she had slipped into that crystal champagne flute was hitting her bloodstream with aggressive, violent force. Then came minute 10. The string quartet was midway through a lively crescendo when Barbara suddenly let out a sharp, guttural gasp. It was not a delicate sound. It was a raw, primal noise that cut right through the music and the polite chatter. The guests immediately around her stepped back, forming a confused circle. I stood perfectly still at the perimeter of the crowd, watching the variables collide. Barbara stumbled backward, her designer heels skidding wildly on the polished marble. She clawed frantically at her own arms, her perfectly manicured nails leaving angry red scratches across her skin. "Get them off me!" she shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual refined polish. "Get them off me right now!" The music screeched to a halting, jarring stop. 200 guests froze in absolute stunned silence. Barbara was spinning in circles, swatting violently at the empty air. Her eyes were wide blown, completely out of proportion, her pupils fully dilated in the bright chandelier light. She was staring at the floor, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "The spiders," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the pristine white marble. "They are everywhere. They are crawling up my legs. Someone help me get them off." She dropped to her knees, tearing at the expensive fabric of her gown. She was hallucinating vividly, completely disconnected from reality. The sophisticated matriarch of the Chicago elite was currently writhing on the ground, sobbing hysterically and batting at imaginary insects. Panic erupted across the ballroom. People began shouting. A waiter dropped a tray of glassware, and the shattering sound echoed like a gunshot. Women in evening gowns backed away in horror, holding their hands over their mouths. And then I saw David. My husband of exactly 4 hours pushed his way through the stunned crowd. A normal son, seeing his mother having a terrifying medical emergency, would have rushed directly to her side. He would have dropped to his knees, checked her pulse, shouted for a doctor, cradled her head. David did none of those things. He burst through the circle of guests and froze. But he was not looking down at his mother, who was currently screaming on the floor. His head snapped up. His eyes darted with frantic, desperate urgency straight past the dance floor, straight past the panicked crowd directly toward the head table. He was looking at the spot where I had been sitting. He was looking at the empty crystal champagne glass resting exactly where Barbara had placed it. His face went entirely pale. It was not the pale of a worried son. It was the ashen, sickening pallor of a man who realized a carefully calculated crime had just failed spectacularly. He spun around, his eyes wildly scanning the crowd until they locked onto me. I was standing quietly near a floral arrangement projecting the image of a shocked, terrified bride. David did not run to his mother. He marched straight toward me. The mask of the charming, loving groom evaporated entirely. His face contorted into something ugly and unrecognizable. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. Before I could even register the physical threat, he grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh with bruising, punishing force. He jerked me forward so violently that the heavy silk of my dress tore slightly at the seam. "Why are you standing?" He hissed, his voice a venomous, panicked whisper that only I could hear over the screaming in the background. I stared at him, letting my eyes widen in feigned confusion, playing the part he expected. "David, what are you talking about?" I cried out softly, letting my voice tremble. "Your mother. She is sick. We need to help her." He shook my arm, his grip tightening painfully. "Do not play dumb with me," he snarled, his hot breath hitting my face. "You were supposed to drink that. Why are you standing?" The world around me seemed to stop spinning. The screaming guests, the shattering glass, the frantic calls for an ambulance all faded into a dull, distant static. In the foster care system, you learn to identify predators. You learn to recognize the exact moment a situation turns lethal. My actuarial brain processed the data in a fraction of a second. David knew about the drug. He did not just know about it, he had expected me to be the one on the floor right now. He had planned for me to be the one screaming about spiders, hallucinating, losing my mind in front of 200 wealthy witnesses. I was married to a man who had actively conspired with his mother to poison me on my wedding day. The sheer psychological weight of that betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I was trapped. I was standing in a ballroom wearing a massive, restricting white gown, surrounded by people who did not know me, married to a predator who wanted to destroy me. Every survival instinct I had, honed over 30 years of life, screamed at me to run, to tear off the dress and flee out the front doors of the hotel. But actuaries do not run from bad data. We manage the risk. We neutralize the threat. If I let him know that I knew he would pivot, he would find another way to trap me. I had to maintain the illusion of total ignorance. I had to become the ultimate liability, a hysterical, useless, emotional bride. "You are hurting me!" I wailed loudly enough for the guests nearest to us to hear. "David, please, you are hurting my arm." "What do you mean, drink what?" I do not understand what is happening to Barbara. The sound of my loud, panicked sobbing forced him to release my arm. He stepped back, suddenly aware that people were beginning to look at us instead of his mother. He quickly plastered a look of frantic concern back onto his face, but his eyes remained cold and furious. The piercing wail of ambulance sirens cut through the thick, heavy air of the ballroom. Paramedics burst through the grand double doors, rolling a stretcher with urgent military precision. They pushed through the crowd, shouting for space, kneeling beside Barbara, who was now hyperventilating and clawing at her own throat. I watched them strap her to the stretcher. I watched them secure her thrashing limbs. I knew exactly what I had to do. The best way to hide from a predator is to stay right in his blind spot. I could not let David out of my sight. I could not let him coordinate a cover story with whoever else might be involved in this massive, calculated deception. I gathered the heavy skirts of my custom wedding gown in both hands and ran toward the stretcher, forcing out loud, racking sobs. I threw myself into the chaotic center of the medical intervention. I grabbed David by the shoulders, burying my face in his tuxedo jacket, weeping uncontrollably. "I am coming with you," I cried out, clinging to him like a desperate, dependent child. "David, I'm so scared. I cannot lose her. I have to come with you to the hospital." David tried to pry my hands off his jacket. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. "Jessica, no," he said, his voice clipped and strained. "You need to stay here. You need to handle the guests. It is going to be far too chaotic in the ambulance." I shook my head violently, messing up my perfectly styled bridal hair, intentionally making myself look completely unhinged. "No," I shrieked, gripping his lapels tighter. "I am your wife. My place is with you. I am not letting you do this alone." A paramedic looked up from securing the stretcher. "Are you family?" He barked loudly over the noise. "We just got married," I sobbed, looking at the paramedic with wide, pleading eyes. "Please let me ride in the back with her. I am family." "Get in," the paramedic ordered, waving me toward the rear doors of the ambulance. "But stay out of our way. We have to push a sedative quickly. Her heart rate is dangerously high." David shot me a look of absolute seething hatred. He was trapped by his own public image. He could not physically force his weeping, terrified new wife out of the ambulance in front of all his high society friends and the emergency medical personnel. He had to play the part of the devoted husband. I climbed awkwardly into the back of the ambulance, the massive layers of white tulle taking up half the available space. I huddled into the corner, pulling my knees up, trying to look as small and vulnerable as possible. David climbed in after me, taking a seat on the opposite bench. The heavy doors slammed shut, enclosing us in the tight, bright, sterile box of the ambulance. The vehicle lurched forward, the siren screaming, as we sped away from the luxury hotel and into the dark Chicago night. The paramedics immediately began working on Barbara, inserting an intravenous line, pushing a clear liquid from a syringe directly into her vein. She let out one final weak whimper about the spiders, before the medical-grade sedative pulled her under, and her body went completely limp on the stretcher. I sat in the corner, burying my face in my hands, keeping up the steady rhythm of my fake sobs. Through the gaps in my fingers, I watched my new husband. David was staring at the floor of the ambulance, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles completely white. He was breathing heavily, his mind visibly racing, trying to calculate how his flawless plan had resulted in his mother strapped to a gurney. He looked up, and our eyes met across the narrow space. I let out another loud wail and reached out a trembling hand toward him, playing the pathetic role perfectly. He did not take my hand. He just stared at me, his eyes narrowing with deep, calculating suspicion. I pulled my hand back and buried my face in my knees, again rocking slightly. My heart was completely cold. My mind was sharp and functioning at peak analytical capacity. The weeping girl in the white dress was just a shield. Behind that shield, the actuary was already building a new model. They had tried to destroy me for reasons I did not yet fully understand. They had underestimated the orphan who had fought for everything she ever had. I continued to rock back and forth in the cramped space of the moving ambulance, letting the harsh fluorescent lights wash over my torn silk dress. Every bump in the Chicago roads jolted me physically, but mentally, I was perfectly still. I thought about the white powder. I thought about how confidently Barbara had dropped it into the glass. That level of confidence does not come from a spontaneous decision. It comes from preparation. It comes from a deeply rehearsed plan. They had acquired the drug. They had plotted the exact moment of delivery during the toast. They had anticipated the crowded room providing the perfect cover. The execution was meant to be flawless, but they had failed to account for my lifelong habit of watching the reflections in a room. When you grow up moving from one foster home to another, you learn that the real danger never comes at you from the front. It always comes from the blind spots. You learn to memorize the exits. You learn to read the micro-expressions of the adults who hold total power over your life, and you learn to never take a drink from a glass. You did not pour yourself unless you have maintained absolute visual contact with it. My survival instincts had not faded just because I had earned a corporate salary and put on a designer gown. They had just gone dormant, waiting for the moment they were needed again. I peeked through my fingers again. David was now staring at his phone, his thumb swiping aggressively across the screen. He was trying to get a signal, trying to communicate with someone on the outside. Was there a third conspirator? Was there someone waiting at the hotel or the hospital? I needed to gather more data before I made a single offensive move. The paramedic shouted vital signs back and forth over the wailing siren. "Her heart rate is 180, they yelled. "Blood pressure is spiking dangerously. What did she ingest? We need to know what she took to counteract it properly." David looked up, his face a mask of faux innocence. "I have absolutely no idea," he lied smoothly, his voice projecting the perfect pitch of a terrified son. "She was just drinking champagne. She does not take any recreational drugs. Maybe she had a severe allergic reaction to the catered dinner. You have to save her, please." I listened to him lie to the medical professionals without a single stutter or hesitation. It was a terrifying display of sociopathic control. If he could lie that easily, while his mother was strapped to a monitor fighting a chemically induced psychosis, He could lie about anything. He had lied to me every single day for the past 2 years. Every promise of a safe future, every smile had been a calculated investment toward whatever ultimate payout they were trying to secure tonight. I let out another loud, prolonged sob, burying my face deeper into my knees. I had to keep him convinced that I was completely broken. If he suspected for a fraction of a second that I had swapped the glasses, he would realize I was an active threat. He would spin the narrative before we even reached the hospital doors. He would claim I was the one who poisoned her. He would use his wealth, his status, and his family name to crush me under the weight of the legal system. I was a woman with no family backing, no social safety net. It would be my word against the established, influential Chicago elite. But I had one massive advantage. I knew the truth, and he did not know that I knew. The ambulance took a sharp right turn, throwing me heavily against the metal wall. The sudden physical impact grounded me. It reminded me that this was not a simulation. This was my actual life. I was trapped in a moving vehicle with a man who had planned to watch me lose my mind. I took a deep, slow breath beneath the cover of my hands. I forced my heart rate to steady. I forced the panic out of my nervous system. I am an actuary. I live in the realm of probabilities, risk margins, and strategic outcomes. David and Barbara had initiated a highly volatile event without understanding the true nature of their target. They thought they had trapped a vulnerable woman desperate for their approval. They did not realize they had just locked themselves in a cage with someone who knew exactly how to survive the darkest parts of human nature. The ambulance slowed to a halt, the sirens cutting off abruptly as we backed into the brightly lit emergency receiving bay of the hospital. The rear doors swung open, revealing a team of nurses and doctors waiting with a crash cart. The chaotic noise of the emergency room flooded into the back of the ambulance. "Move, move, move!" the lead paramedic shouted as they unlatched Barbara's stretcher and rolled her rapidly down the ramp. David scrambled out right behind them, chasing the stretcher into the sterile white corridors of the hospital. I took one final second sitting alone in the back of the ambulance. I wiped the fake tears from my cheeks. I smoothed down the torn, ripped fabric of my beautiful, expensive wedding gown. I locked my emotions away in a cold, impenetrable vault deep inside my mind. I took a sharp, steadying breath. Then I painted the mask of the terrified, weeping bride back onto my face and stepped out into the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency bay, ready to dismantle my husband's entire world. The harsh glare of the emergency room hit me like a physical blow, as the automatic sliding glass doors of Chicago Memorial Hospital parted with a mechanical hiss. We were swallowed instantly into a chaotic world of sterile white tiles, the sharp metallic scent of rubbing alcohol, and the relentless beeping of medical monitors. I was still clutching the heavy layers of my ruined custom silk wedding gown, dragging the expensive fabric across the cold linoleum floor. I made sure my breathing remained shallow and deliberately erratic. I forced my hands to tremble violently as I gripped the edge of the reception desk. I was playing the role of the traumatized, naive bride, and I knew I had to perform flawlessly. David paced the length of the waiting area like a caged animal. His tuxedo jacket was discarded. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and his pristine white shirt was deeply wrinkled. He was sweating profusely. It was a cold, clammy sweat that had absolutely nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He was rapidly losing control of the variables, and watching him unravel was a terrifying validation of my absolute worst fears. Every single time a nurse walked past our section of the waiting room, David lunged forward, demanding immediate answers. He was aggressive, loud, and utterly desperate to steer the narrative before the medical staff could draw their own conclusions. He kept glancing over at me, his eyes calculating, testing the waters to see if my hysterical facade was cracking. I gave him nothing but wide, terrified eyes and muffled sobs. I wrapped my arms around my torso, shivering not from the frigid hospital air, but from the proximity to a predator who had just tried to violently erase my mind. My actuarial training kept my pulse steady beneath the outward display of panic. I was cataloging everything in the environment: the number of security cameras in the hallway, the distance to the nearest exit doors, the exact sequence of David's increasingly frantic lies. I knew that if I showed even a fraction of my true mental clarity, he would instantly realize his trap had failed, and he would pivot to a much more dangerous strategy: After what felt like hours, but was statistically only 47 minutes, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open. A tall, exhausted-looking attending physician in green scrubs stepped out holding a digital tablet. David intercepted him before the doctor could take 3 steps into the waiting room. I trailed closely behind David, making sure I was positioned to hear every single word, while keeping my face buried partially in my hands. How was my mother? David demanded, his voice pitched loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear. What kind of food poisoning is this? She ate the crab cakes at the reception. I told the caterers we needed absolute quality control. This is a massive liability issue for the hotel. The physician looked at David with a flat, uncompromising expression. It was the exact look a seasoned medical professional gives when they know they are being actively lied to. Mr. Myers, your mother does not have food poisoning, the doctor said, his voice calm, but carrying a razor-sharp edge of authority. We just got our comprehensive toxicology report back from the laboratory. Your mother ingested a massive, highly dangerous dose of a synthetic hallucinogenic sedative. It is a potent black market chemical compound, usually associated with severe psychological distress and rapid nervous system suppression. If she had not received immediate medical intervention, her respiratory system would have collapsed entirely. The words hung heavy and cold in the sterile hospital air. I let out a loud, gasping sob, covering my mouth with both hands. Inside my mind, the tumblers clicked into place, locking the final, horrifying pieces of the puzzle together. A black market hallucinogenic sedative. It was meant to make me look completely insane. It was meant to break my mind publicly and violently on the most important day of my life in front of 200 influential witnesses. David spun around to face the doctor, his face contorted in a mask of aggressive panic denial. That is absolutely impossible, he shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at the physician. My mother is a prominent, respected member of Chicago society. She does not take street drugs. Your laboratory made a catastrophic mistake. It must have been a severe allergic reaction to the catering. I demand you run the blood tests again right now. You are violating her medical privacy by discussing this out here in the open. The doctor stood his ground, entirely unbothered by David's explosive outburst. The toxicology screen is definitive, Mr. Myers. We are legally required to report the presence of these specific illicit compounds to the hospital administration and potentially the local authorities, given the highly suspicious nature of the ingestion. David panicked entirely. I saw the raw animal terror flash violently in his eyes. He turned to me, grabbing my upper arm with that same bruising, punishing grip he had used back in the ballroom. Jessica, we are leaving this waiting room right now, he hissed, pulling me forcefully toward a secluded, dark hallway. You need to sit down in a private family room. You are far too hysterical to hear this medical jargon. Give me your cell phone. You need to rest your eyes. He was trying to isolate me. He desperately needed to cut off my communication with the outside world. He needed to lock me in a room where he could control the narrative, break down my defenses, and figure out how to force me to sign whatever predatory legal documents he had waiting for me. Before David could drag me 2 steps down the corridor, a large, steady hand clamped down firmly onto David's shoulder. Let her go, David. The voice was deep, resonant, and carried an absolute authority that demanded instant, unquestioning compliance. I turned my head and saw Marcus. Marcus was 35 years old, a towering, athletic African-American man who commanded immense respect the second he walked into any room. He was married to Sarah, David's older sister. For the 2 years I had known this family, Marcus had always been the quiet, brilliant observer at the edges of their lavish dinner parties. While Barbara mocked my upbringing and David paraded his fake wealth, Marcus would sit back watching them all with sharp, discerning eyes. I always knew he saw through their polished facades because he was a forensic financial analyst for a major federal consulting firm. His entire career was built on dismantling fraud, finding hidden money, and bringing arrogant white-collar criminals to devastating justice. He was the ultimate outsider in their toxic bloodline, and right now, he was my only lifeline. David released my arm instinctively, stepping back from the sheer imposing physical presence of his brother-in-law. Marcus, what are you doing here? David stammered, trying and failing to regain his dominant posture. You are supposed to be back at the hotel managing the guests with Sarah. Sarah is handling the remaining guests, Marcus said smoothly, his dark gaze locking onto David with a terrifying, unyielding intensity. The hospital administration is looking for the immediate next of kin to sign the emergency intake liability forms. They are waiting for you at the front desk right now. They said if you do not sign them immediately, they cannot legally proceed with the specialized treatment protocols required for your mother's chemical ingestion. It was a brilliant, highly calculated lie. Marcus knew exactly how to trigger David's ego and his desperate need to control the medical and legal narrative. David hesitated, glancing nervously between me and Marcus. I will take Jessica to get some water and help her calm down. Marcus continued his tone, leaving absolute zero room for negotiation. She is trembling. Go sign the papers, David. We will be right here when you get back. David gritted his teeth, but he had absolutely no choice. He could not argue with Marcus without looking incredibly suspicious and guilty in front of the watching nursing staff. Do not leave this floor, David ordered, pointing a warning finger directly at me. I nodded weakly, wiping away a fake tear and burying my face into my hands. The exact second David turned the corner toward the administrative desks, Marcus dropped the polite, supportive brother-in-law act completely. He did not take me to the water fountain. He placed a gentle but incredibly firm hand on the small of my back and guided me swiftly down a narrow side corridor, pushing open a heavy industrial fire door that led into a dimly lit concrete stairwell. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind us, instantly silencing the chaotic noise of the emergency room. We were completely alone. The air was cool and smelled faintly of damp concrete and antiseptic. I leaned against the rough cinder block wall, my chest heaving, preparing to keep up my hysterical facade. I opened my mouth to sob to tell him how scared I was about Barbara. But Marcus cut me off before I could make a single sound. Drop the act, Jessica Marcus said quietly. His voice echoed slightly in the empty, cavernous stairwell. I stopped breathing. I stared at him, my hands frozen in the shredded fabric of my wedding dress. He crossed his arms over his perfectly tailored suit, looking at me with a profound, knowing sadness. I know you did not drink the champagne, he said, his voice steady and calm, and I know you are smart enough to realize exactly what was in it. You are an actuary. You assess risk and analyze patterns for a living. You saw exactly what Barbara did, and you outmaneuvered her at the table. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs, but a strange, massive wave of relief washed over my entire body. I did not have to pretend with him. I let my tense shoulders drop. I let my face relax into its natural, calculated neutrality. The terrified, weeping bride vanished completely, leaving only the cold, analytical woman who had spent her entire life surviving bad situations. How long have you known? I asked, my voice suddenly steady, crisp, and completely devoid of emotion. I have known this family is entirely morally bankrupt since the day I married into it, Marcus replied, his eyes dark with a quiet, simmering anger. But I did not realize exactly how far they were truly willing to go until this morning. David has been acting erratic for weeks. He has been taking secret phone calls outside, receiving strange, unmarked packages. I am a forensic financial analyst, Jessica. I follow the paper trails that arrogant people try to burn. When the wedding preparations were in full swing this morning, and David was distracted taking photos with his groomsmen, I went into his private locked home office. I bypassed his rudimentary security firewalls. I pulled his master financial ledgers. Marcus reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick stack of folded printer paper. The pages were covered in dense spreadsheets, tiny rows of numbers, red margins, and glaring deficit markers. He unfolded the papers and handed them to me. The harsh, overhead fluorescent light of the stairwell illuminated the financial ruin printed clearly on those pages. I took the papers, my eyes scanning the raw data with rapid professional precision. As an actuary, I read complex financial statements the way other people read simple storybooks. The numbers leaped off the page, telling a horrifying, undeniable story of total catastrophic failure. There were multiple limited liability companies registered exclusively in David and Barbara's names. Every single one of them was completely insolvent. There were massive high-interest loans tied to commercial real estate ventures that had completely defaulted months ago. There were toxic secondary mortgages on properties they did not even fully own. The debt was absolutely staggering, It was not just a few missed car payments or overdrawn credit cards. It was millions of dollars of leveraged toxic debt accelerating rapidly toward an inevitable devastating crash. I tracked the columns calculating the exorbitant interest rates, the massive default penalties, the looming balloon payments that were explicitly due within the next 30 days. I looked up at Marcus, the cold, terrifying reality of my situation settling deep into my bones like winter frost. Marcus stepped closer, leaning in, so his voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the heavy, devastating weight of a death sentence. "They aren't rich, Jessica," he said. His eyes locked onto mine, reflecting my own dawning horror. "They are drowning. They are $3 million in debt, and the aggressive creditors are preparing to legally seize every single asset they have left. You were never meant to be a cherished wife. You were meant to be a permanent financial bailout." I peered through the narrow rectangular wire mesh window of the heavy concrete stairwell door. The emergency room waiting area was a chaotic blur of green scrubs and security personnel, but my eyes locked instantly onto David. 2 Chicago police officers had arrived. They stood tall and imposing in their dark blue uniforms, intercepting David just as he finished filling out the emergency intake forms at the front desk. I held my breath, pressing my palm against the cold metal of the door, watching the man I had married just 4 hours ago perform the most incredible acting routine of his entire life. Through the thick glass, I could not hear the exact words being exchanged, but I could read every single micro-expression on his face. My actuarial training relies heavily on interpreting physical data, and David was putting on a flawless masterclass in deception. He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, intentionally ruining his polished groom aesthetic to look frantic and overwhelmed. He gestured wildly toward the intensive care, double doors pointing at his chest, and then shaking his head in desperate disbelief. He was selling them the allergy narrative. He was looking those 2 veteran police officers dead in the eyes and convincing them that his wealthy, respectable mother must have accidentally ingested a severe food allergen from the luxury wedding catering. I watched him physically lean into one of the officers, dropping his shoulders, playing the vulnerable, terrified son, begging the authorities for help. The police officers visibly softened. One of them actually put a sympathetic hand on David's shoulder. He was winning them over completely. The sheer sociopathic ease with which he manipulated those officers sent a violent shockwave of pure ice straight down my spine. This was not a man who was simply trying to cover up a sudden mistake. This was a man who had spent his entire life manipulating every single person in his orbit. He was a professional predator, and I had willingly walked right into his meticulously constructed cage. I stepped back from the door, letting the heavy metal barrier block out the sight of my new husband. I turned back to face Marcus. The stark overhead fluorescent light of the stairwell cast long, harsh shadows across his face. He was still holding the thick stack of financial spreadsheets he had pulled from David's home office during the wedding preparations. Marcus did not offer me empty platitudes or useless words of comfort. He knew I did not need a shoulder to cry on. I needed hard, irrefutable data. He stepped forward and held the first spreadsheet up to the light, tracing a long column of red numbers with his index finger. "Look at the corporate structures, Jessica," he said, his voice a low, urgent rumble that echoed slightly off the concrete walls. "These are not legitimate business investments. These are desperate, frantic gambles." He flipped to the second page, showing me a complex web of limited liability companies, all registered to the same 2 names, David and Barbara. I focused my actuarial mind entirely on the numbers, shutting out the emotional horror of my ruined wedding day. The math was devastatingly clear. They had engaged in highly aggressive commercial real estate flipping, buying massive dilapidated properties on margin with the expectation of quick renovations and massive returns. But the market had shifted abruptly. The properties had sat empty, bleeding money for over 2 years. To cover their initial massive losses, they had taken out secondary and tertiary loans from private unregulated lenders with exorbitant predatory interest rates. The debt was compounding exponentially. They were trapped in a classic death spiral of toxic leverage. Marcus pointed to the bottom line of a consolidated balance sheet. $3 million, he stated, his voice utterly devoid of any warmth. That is their absolute minimum immediate exposure. $3 million in toxic debt that is coming due immediately. The private lenders have already initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. They are threatening to seize the primary family estate. They are threatening to freeze the bank accounts. In less than 30 days, Barbara and David will be publicly and humiliatingly bankrupt. They will lose the mansion, they will lose the country club memberships, they will lose every single ounce of their precious social standing in Chicago. They are completely destitute. I stared at the red numbers swimming across the page. $3 million. It was an astronomical sum. It was a black hole of financial ruin. But as I processed the magnitude of their desperation, a different, far more terrifying question formed in my mind. If they were $3 million in debt, why on earth were they spending hundreds of thousands of dollars hosting a lavish luxury wedding at one of the most expensive hotels in the city? Why put on this massive, expensive charade when the bank was literally knocking on the front door ready to take everything they owned? I looked up from the papers, my breathing shallow, my mind racing through the variables. Why me? I whispered the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. Marcus, you know my background. I do not come from their world. I grew up in the state foster care system. I do not have a prominent family name. I do not have wealthy parents throwing money at me. Why would a family drowning in debt target an orphaned actuary with a modest corporate salary? Marcus looked at me with a deep, profound sorrow in his eyes. Because you have the one thing they desperately need, Jessica, he replied softly. You have unprecedented liquidity. The word hit me like a physical strike to the chest. Liquidity. My aunt. The woman who had finally pulled me out of the foster care system when I was 16 years old. She was a quiet, frugal woman who lived in a modest home and drove a 10-year-old car. She had never married, and she had worked tirelessly her entire life as an early software developer and aggressive private investor. When she passed away suddenly from an aneurysm 6 months ago, my entire world had shattered. She was the only real family I had ever known. But in the wake of her tragic death, I had received the shock of a lifetime. My quiet, unassuming aunt had amassed an incredible fortune, and she had placed every single penny of it into a secure private trust fund with my name as the sole absolute beneficiary. $5 million. $5 million of clean, untethered liquid assets, sitting securely in a top-tier financial institution. I had told David about the inheritance during a quiet, vulnerable moment of grief, thinking I was sharing a deeply personal family secret with my future husband. I had trusted him with the exact details of the trust fund. I had told him the money was meant for our future, for the children we would eventually have, for a life of absolute security. I closed my eyes as the sickening realization washed over my entire body. He did not see a future with me. He saw a massive glowing payout. My inheritance was the exact mathematical solution to their $3 million problem. With my $5 million, they could pay off their toxic real estate loans, settle with the aggressive private lenders, and still have $2 million left over to maintain their lavish, deceptive lifestyle. I was not a cherished bride. I was a financial acquisition. I was a hostile corporate takeover wrapped in white silk and a diamond ring. But a trust fund is notoriously difficult to crack. My aunt had structured it brilliantly. David could not simply transfer the funds into his own personal account just because we had signed a marriage certificate this afternoon. He needed my explicit legal authorization. He needed my signature. And if I refused to give it to him, he needed to find a way to legally bypass my personal autonomy entirely. My eyes snapped open. I looked at Marcus, the absolute sheer horror of their complete plan finally snapping into perfect, terrifying clarity. The drug. I breathed, my voice shaking so violently I could barely form the words. The powder Barbara put into the crystal glass. It was not meant to kill me. If I died, the trust fund legally defaults to a series of selected charitable organizations. My death serves absolutely no financial purpose to them at all. Marcus nodded, his face grim and tight. Exactly, he confirmed. That is why they used a massive dose of a hallucinogenic sedative. I watched Barbara writhing on the ballroom floor, screaming about spiders, Marcus. I watched her lose her entire connection to reality in front of 200 people. If I had taken that glass, I would have been the one screaming on the floor. I would have suffered a violent, highly public psychotic break on my wedding night. I grabbed the rough concrete of the stairwell wall, feeling my knees threaten to buckle under the sheer psychological weight of their pure evil. David would have played the devastated husband. I whispered the narrative forming in my mind with cold, clinical precision. He would have accompanied me in the ambulance, just like I accompanied his mother. He would have told the emergency room doctors that the stress of the wedding had triggered a massive latent psychological collapse. He would have used my history in the foster care system to claim I had underlying deep-rooted mental health trauma. He would have had me involuntarily committed to a locked psychiatric ward tonight. Yes, Marcus said, his voice hard and resolute. And once you were locked inside a secure psychiatric facility, heavily medicated, and completely stripped of your legal capacity to make your own decisions, David would execute his final move. He is your legally wedded husband as of 4 hours ago. He would immediately petition the hospital and the courts for emergency medical and financial power of attorney. He would claim you were totally incapacitated and that he needed to immediately manage your affairs to pay for your long-term specialized psychiatric care. The final piece of the puzzle clicked securely into place. With emergency power of attorney, David would have absolute total legal control over my $5 million trust fund. He would drain the accounts instantly, transferring the wealth to cover their $3 million commercial real estate debt. By the time I woke up from the chemically induced psychosis, by the time I convinced the psychiatric doctors that I was perfectly sane and had been intentionally poisoned, my money would be completely gone, erased, swallowed by their bankrupt empire. And I would be trapped in a mental institution fighting a husband who controlled every single aspect of my medical and financial existence. The sheer magnitude of their cruelty was breathtaking. They did not just want to steal my money, they wanted to steal my mind. They wanted to steal my freedom, my autonomy, and my entire future. They viewed me as nothing more than a disposable sacrificial lamb meant to be slaughtered on the altar of their social status. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer shaking. The terrified, weeping bride was officially dead. The panic had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hardened core of pure, absolute rage. I looked up at Marcus. They wanted to play a game with my life, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, unyielding calm. But they severely miscalculated the risk. I am going to destroy them, Marcus. I am going to tear their entire world down to the studs, and I am going to make them watch. The heavy metal door of the stairwell suddenly groaned and pulled open with a sharp, violent screech. The harsh fluorescent light from the hospital corridor flooded into our dark, secluded space. I shoved the printed financial spreadsheets behind my back instantly, but my heart rate skyrocketed. Standing in the doorway, perfectly framed by the stark hospital lighting, was Sarah, David's older sister, Marcus's wife. She was wearing a floor-length emerald green silk gown that probably cost more than my entire first-year salary out of college. Her blonde hair was pinned back in an immaculate chignon, and her makeup was completely flawless. There was absolutely no trace of panic or grief on her face. Her mother was currently lying in an intensive care unit, hooked to a dozen machines fighting a chemically induced psychological break, and Sarah looked as though she had just stepped out of a high society charity gala, mildly annoyed by the inconvenience. Sarah let the heavy door click shut behind her, cutting off the noise of the emergency room once again. She took 2 slow, deliberate steps down the concrete stairs. The sharp clicking of her designer heels echoed loudly in the enclosed space. She did not look at me at first. She looked directly at her husband. Her blue eyes, icy and unreadable, scanned Marcus from head to toe. Then her gaze dropped to the edges of the white printer paper sticking out from behind my back. She did not gasp. She did not ask us what we were doing hiding in a stairwell. She simply crossed her arms over her chest and tilted her head. "I know exactly what you are holding, Marcus," she said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any marital warmth. "Do not insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. I saw you leave the ballroom right after the ambulance departed. I knew you would not be able to resist digging into David's private office while the house was empty. You always were far too obsessed with other people's ledgers." Marcus stood incredibly still, his broad shoulders tense, his jaw clenched tight. "You knew," I whispered, the realization hitting me with sickening force. "You knew about the $3 million in debt. You knew they were bankrupt." Sarah finally shifted her gaze to me. She looked at me with the exact same expression her mother had used for 2 years. Complete, absolute disdain. Of course I knew Jessica, she snapped, her tone dripping with condescension. It is my family. Did you really think David could hide a catastrophic financial collapse from me? We grew up managing assets. We know how to read the writing on the wall. The real estate market shifted. David and my mother made some highly leveraged aggressive bets that did not pay off. It is a temporary liquidity crisis. It happens to people in our tax bracket. We manage it. We survive. A temporary liquidity crisis. I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts to keep it calm. Sarah, they are $3 million in debt. They are facing aggressive foreclosure. And your mother just deliberately ingested a black market hallucinogenic drug right in front of 200 people at my wedding reception. She tried to poison me. I waited for the shock to register on Sarah's face. I waited for the denial, the horror, the basic human decency of a woman realizing her family had just attempted to orchestrate a violent crime. But the shock never came. Sarah did not flinch. She simply let out a long, exasperated sigh and rolled her eyes as if I had just complained about the catering menu. "Do not be so dramatic, Jessica," Sarah said smoothly, adjusting a diamond bracelet on her wrist. "Nobody tried to kill you. My mother is a very calculated woman. The dosage was precisely measured to induce a severe temporary psychological episode. You would have embarrassed yourself. You would have been quietly checked into a private psychiatric facility for a few weeks, and David would have assumed emergency power of attorney. It was a very clean, very practical business solution to a highly pressing family problem. You have $5 million sitting in a trust fund doing absolutely nothing. We needed the capital. It was simply a reallocation of resources." The sheer sociopathic casualness of her explanation made the blood freeze in my veins. She was talking about stealing my mind and my entire inheritance as if it were a simple corporate merger. I looked at Marcus. His face was a mask of absolute, pure devastation. He had known this family was toxic. He had known they were manipulative and arrogant. But hearing his own wife openly justify a malicious, calculated poisoning to steal a trust fund was breaking his heart in real time. "You are a monster," Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated off the concrete walls. "You are standing here defending a violent criminal act against an innocent woman. You are actively complicit in a plot to destroy her life." Sarah turned her icy glare back to her husband. "Do not take that moral high ground with me, Marcus," she warned, her voice dropping into a vicious, threatening whisper. "You married into this family. You enjoy the social connections. You enjoy the country club memberships. You enjoy the pristine reputation that comes with our last name. You do not get to reap the benefits of our status, and then suddenly develop a conscience when things get difficult." "I am going to the police," Marcus stated, taking a step toward the heavy metal door. "I am walking out there right now, finding those 2 officers in the waiting room, and handing them these financial ledgers. I am going to tell them exactly what your mother did, and exactly why David wanted Jessica incapacitated." Sarah did not move to block his path. She simply smiled. It was a terrifying, wicked smile that looked exactly like Barbara's. "Go ahead, Marcus," she challenged him, stepping aside and gesturing toward the door. "Walk out there. Hand them the papers. But before you do, you should carefully calculate the exact outcome of that action. You are a forensic analyst. Do the math." Marcus stopped, his hand hovering just inches from the door handle. "Let us look at the variables," Sarah continued, her voice dripping with venomous confidence. "You are going to tell 2 Chicago police officers that my mother, a highly respected prominent philanthropist, intentionally poisoned herself at her son's wedding. You are going to claim that my brother, a successful real estate developer, orchestrated this bizarre, convoluted plot to steal his new bride's money. And your only proof is a printed spreadsheet that you illegally obtained by breaking into my brother's private locked office without a warrant." She took a slow, deliberate step toward us, closing the physical distance, forcing us to feel the full weight of her malicious threat. "And what do you think the police will see when they look at this situation?" she asked rhetorically. "I will tell you exactly what they will see. They will see a tragic medical emergency. They will see a wealthy, beloved matriarch fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. And then they will look at Jessica." Sarah turned her cold blue eyes onto me. raking her gaze up and down my torn, ruined wedding dress. They will see an orphan, a girl with no family, no background, and a long documented history in the state foster care system. A girl who suddenly inherited a massive fortune and married into a family vastly outside her social class. If you go to the police right now, Marcus, I will walk right out behind you and tell them a very different story. What story? I demanded, my voice tight with suppressed rage. I will tell them that you did it, Sarah said, her smile widening into something truly evil. I will tell them that you have always harbored a deep, jealous resentment toward my mother. I will tell them that you could not handle her wealth, her grace, or her influence. I will swear under oath that I saw you hovering over her champagne glass during the reception. I will say you wanted to eliminate her, to completely isolate David and secure your position in the family. I will paint you as a deeply disturbed, greedy, unstable woman who tried to murder her own mother-in-law on her wedding day. You are lying, I spat, clutching the financial documents to my chest. They would never believe you. The toxicology report proves she ingested the drug, and I will say you slipped it to her. Sarah countered instantly, her mind working with terrifying speed. Who do you think a judge and a jury will believe in a city like Chicago? My family has deep entrenched political connections. We dine with the district attorneys. We play golf with the judges. You are nobody, Jessica. You are a statistical rounding error. If it comes down to a battle of reputations, you will lose. You will not just lose your trust fund. You will go to a federal prison for attempted murder. The air in the stairwell felt suddenly completely devoid of oxygen. My actuarial brain began spinning violently, processing every single variable, every single risk factor, every single possible outcome. Sarah was right. It was the most horrifying, deeply unfair reality of the modern American justice system. But she was absolutely right. Wealth and social status dictate the narrative. If Marcus and I walked out there right now making wild accusations about a complex financial poisoning plot, we would look like the aggressors. We would look like opportunistic vultures trying to capitalize on a wealthy woman's sudden medical crisis. I did not have video evidence. I did not have a confession. I only had stolen financial records and my own word against a powerful, influential dynasty. Marcus realized it too. I saw the grim, devastating acceptance wash over his face. He lowered his hand from the door handle, his broad shoulders slumping under the immense weight of his wife's absolute betrayal. What do you want? Sarah Marcus asked, his voice completely hollow, stripped of all its former strength. You did not follow us into this stairwell just to gloat. You want something. Sarah's smile vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating glare. I want you to fix this, Marcus. David's plan was sloppy and it failed. Now my mother is in a hospital bed and the creditors are still circling. We still need $3 million by the end of the month to prevent total public bankruptcy. And since Jessica is standing here perfectly conscious and stubbornly sane, we clearly cannot use her trust fund today. She reached into her designer clutch purse and pulled out a thick, legally bound document. She held it out toward her husband. This is an asset transfer agreement, Sarah stated, her voice sharp and commanding. It legally transfers all of your private retirement accounts, your independent stock portfolios, and the equity in your personal investment properties directly into the primary family holding account. It equals roughly $2.8 million. With that capital and a few liquidated assets, we can pay off the private lenders and quietly stabilize the commercial properties. We can save the family name. You want me to bankrupt myself? Marcus asked, staring at the document in absolute disbelief. You want me to hand over everything I have worked for my entire adult life to save your brother from his own toxic gambling? I want you to protect your family, Sarah corrected, her tone completely devoid of any empathy or love. You owe us, Marcus. We elevated you. We brought you into our world. Now it is time to pay the admission fee. You sign these papers tonight right here in this hospital. If you sign them, I will keep my mouth shut. I will play the supportive daughter. We will tell the police my mother had a bad reaction to a prescribed medication. Jessica gets to keep her trust fund and her freedom. We all walk away quiet and protected. And if I refuse, Marcus challenged, his hands balling into tight, furious fists at his sides. Sarah stepped right up to him, tilting her head back to look him dead in the eyes. If you refuse, I walk out that door and I tell the police Jessica tried to kill my mother. I will drag both of you through a highly publicized, brutal legal nightmare. I will make sure Jessica spends her 30s in a prison cell. And I will make sure your professional reputation as a forensic analyst is completely, permanently destroyed. I will ruin you both. The choice is yours. She turned on her heel, her designer dress swishing elegantly against the concrete. She pushed the heavy metal door open, the bright hospital light flooding back into the dark space. I will be in the waiting room, she said over her shoulder, not looking back. Do not make me wait long. The door slammed shut, leaving Marcus and me alone in the oppressive silence. I leaned against the wall, my entire body trembling with the adrenaline and the terror. My mind was racing, analyzing the data, calculating the odds, running every possible scenario through my mental risk matrix. We were completely cornered. It was a flawless, ruthless two-front war. If we fought back right now, we would trigger a massive legal avalanche that would crush us both. Sarah had leverage. She had the social capital, the family name, and the absolute lack of a moral compass required to completely destroy my life. Marcus looked at me, his eyes dark with a profound, desperate apology. Jessica, he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. I am so sorry. I cannot let her send you to prison. I cannot let them do that to you. I will sign the papers. I will give her the money. I will find a way to rebuild. No, I said, my voice suddenly cutting through the quiet stairwell like a sharp silver blade. Marcus blinked, staring at me in confusion. What? I pushed myself off the concrete wall, standing up straight. The terrified victim narrative completely washed away from my mind. I am an actuary, Marcus. I do not accept forced losses, and I do not negotiate with terrorists. If we surrender now, they will never stop. They will drain your accounts today, and tomorrow they will find another way to drain mine. Predators do not stop hunting just because you feed them once. But she has the narrative, Jessica, Marcus argued, running a frustrated hand over his face. She will go to the police. She will ruin you. Only if she controls the battlefield. I countered, my brain working with cold, absolute precision. She thinks we are trapped because she assumes we have to play by her rules. She assumes our only options are immediate surrender or immediate public confrontation. But she made a massive statistical error. What error? Marcus asked, leaning closer, his analytical mind catching up to my rapid strategic pivot. She gave us time, I explained, looking down at the financial documents still clutched in my hands. She gave us a window to act. She thinks she has boxed us in, but all she really did was confirm exactly how desperate they truly are. They need money tonight. David still thinks he can salvage his original plan. He still thinks I'm a naive, hysterical bride who does not know anything about the poison or the bankruptcy. I looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze with absolute, unyielding resolve. We are not going to the police right now, Marcus. And you are absolutely not signing away your retirement accounts. We cannot run from this trap. So we are going to let them spring it. We are going to walk right back out into that hospital. I am going to play the terrified dependent wife. And we are going to let David think he is winning. We are going to let them build their own perfect, flawless legal snare. And then I smiled, a cold, hard smile that belonged to the girl who had survived the foster care system against all statistical odds. And then we are going to catch them in it. Let us go to work. I pushed the heavy metal door of the stairwell open, letting the bright, sterile light of the hospital corridor wash over my torn silk wedding dress. Marcus walked silently beside me, a towering shadow of absolute focus. We did not exchange another word because we simply did not need to. We had established our risk matrix, and we were now entering the execution phase of the most critical operation of my entire life. I closed my eyes for one brief, agonizing second. I mentally locked away the highly competent analytical actuary who managed millions of dollars in corporate risk. I shoved her deep into a dark, impenetrable vault inside my mind. In her place, I resurrected the terrified, desperate foster child I used to be. I brought back the girl who learned how to survive by making herself look completely small, fragile, and entirely dependent on the adults who held the ultimate power to destroy her. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing my posture to project total physical vulnerability. I forced my breathing to become deliberately shallow, erratic, and violently fast. I willed my hands to shake with a visible aggressive tremor. By the time Marcus and I rounded the corner into the main waiting area of the intensive care unit, I was a perfect, flawless picture of a woman on the absolute brink of a massive psychological breakdown. David was standing near the pristine reception desk, holding a small styrofoam cup of water, pretending to look utterly devastated. Sarah was sitting in a stiff plastic chair nearby, scrolling through her designer smartphone with cold, complete indifference. When David saw me stumbling down the hallway, leaning heavily against the pristine white walls, his entire demeanor shifted instantly. I watched his micro-expressions carefully as he moved rapidly toward me. There was no genuine relief in his dark eyes. There was only a hungry, calculating assessment. He was looking at my shaking hands, my erratic breathing, and my tear-stained face. And he was seeing a massive, undeniable victory. He truly believed that the extreme trauma of watching his mother collapse had done the heavy lifting for him. He firmly believed my mind was fracturing right on schedule, exactly as he had planned. I let my knees give out slightly, just enough to make him lunge forward and catch my weight. He wrapped his strong arms around my waist, hauling me up against his chest, playing the role of the protective hero. I buried my face in his wrinkled white dress shirt, gripping his lapels with white-knuckled desperation. "David," I gasped out, letting my voice crack and pitch upward into a hysterical, pathetic whine. "David, I am so terrified. I cannot breathe properly. My chest is so incredibly tight. I feel like the walls are closing in on me." He stroked my hair, murmuring soft, soothing lies into my ear. "It is okay, Jessica," he whispered, his voice dripping with artificial toxic comfort. "You are just having a severe panic attack. The shock of tonight has simply been too much for your fragile system to handle. You just need to sit down and let me take complete control of everything." I clung to him even harder, digging my fingernails into his jacket, pretending to seek refuge in the very arms that were actively building my cage. I let out a long, trembling sob, dragging air into my lungs like a drowning victim. "I am so scared, David." I cried out, making sure my voice carried across the quiet waiting room so Sarah could hear every single pathetic word. "I saw what happened to your mother on the dance floor. 1 second she was perfectly fine, and the next second her entire brain just stopped functioning. She lost her mind, David. She completely lost her mind without any warning at all. What if that happens to me? What if my brain just snaps and I cannot take care of myself?" I felt his entire body stiffen against mine. The bait was dangling directly in front of his face, perfectly tailored to his specific predatory desires. I was voluntarily handing him the exact narrative he desperately needed to steal my $5 million inheritance. I was doing his job for him. "You cannot think like that, Jessica." He hushed me, pulling me toward a secluded cluster of vinyl chairs in the corner of the waiting room. "You are perfectly healthy. You are just overwhelmed by your underlying childhood trauma." I shook my head violently, intentionally messing up my elaborate bridal hair to look even more unstable. "No, David, you do not understand," I wailed, sinking heavily into the plastic chair and pulling my knees up toward my chest. "Life is so incredibly unpredictable. I have no real family left. My aunt is gone. If I have a sudden medical episode like your mother just did, I have absolutely no one to speak for me. I have no legal protection. The state could take over my medical care. They could freeze my accounts. I would be totally trapped in the system again, just like when I was a little girl. I cannot go back to that, David. I absolutely cannot let strangers control my life." I stared up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, projecting pure, unadulterated terror. He looked down at me, his chest rising and falling quickly. His greed was a tangible physical presence in the space between us. It was blinding him completely to any potential risk or logic. A seasoned predator might have paused to question why his victim was suddenly offering him the exact weapon he needed to destroy her. But David was not a seasoned predator. He was an arrogant, desperate man drowning in $3 million of toxic commercial debt, and I was holding out a golden life preserver. "We need to protect ourselves, David," I whispered, reaching out with a trembling hand to grasp his wrist. "We just got married today. We need to make sure we are legally covered if a tragedy strikes. We need to draft emergency legal protections for each other tonight. Right now. Before anything else bad happens to us." David stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer predatory elation. He could barely contain the victorious smirk trying to break through his mask of husbandly concern. He knelt down in front of my chair, taking both of my shaking hands in his. "Jessica, that is a very serious legal step," he said, pretending to be cautious while his thumbs eagerly stroked my knuckles. "Are you absolutely sure you want to think about legal paperwork right now? You are highly emotional." I am sure I sobbed loudly, nodding my head with frantic energy. "I will not be able to sleep knowing I am completely legally exposed. I need to know you have the legal authority to make my medical and financial decisions if my mind breaks down. I need a power of attorney, David. I need you to be my designated proxy. Please tell me we can do this tonight." David let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, acting as if I was forcing him into a massive, burdensome responsibility. "Okay, Jessica," he said, his voice thick with fake reluctance. "If this is truly the only way to calm your severe anxiety, I will handle it. We will establish a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney immediately." He stood up quickly, his movement suddenly sharp and completely energized. He did not say he would call a lawyer in the morning. He did not say we should wait until after his mother was stable. He walked directly over to the sleek black leather briefcase he had brought with him from the wedding reception. He popped the silver latches open and reached inside. My heart turned entirely to ice inside my chest. I watched him pull a thick stack of pristine legal documents from a manila folder. They were already printed. They were already collated. They were already completely prepared. He had brought a pre-drafted total power of attorney document to our luxury wedding reception. The sheer terrifying magnitude of his premeditation hit me with a sickening wave of nausea. This was not a crime of sudden opportunity. He had not decided to steal my trust fund on a whim. He had meticulously planned this entire violent orchestrated event. He had printed the documents knowing full well he intended to drug me, force me into a terrifying psychotic break, and then use my resulting institutionalization to legally compel my signature. He had literally packed the paperwork to steal my entire life right next to his wedding vows. I stared at the thick stack of papers in his hands, fighting down the powerful urge to vomit all over my ruined silk dress. I had to maintain the absolute illusion of compliance. I reached out for the documents with eager, trembling fingers, acting as if he had just handed me a shield instead of a loaded gun. "Oh, thank God," I cried out, clutching the heavy legal packet against my chest. "Thank you, David. You always know exactly how to fix things. You are so prepared. I just want you to feel safe, my love," he lied smoothly, sitting down in the chair next to me and pulling a silver pen from his breast pocket. "I actually had my attorney draft these up a few weeks ago as a standard precaution for our new marriage, but I did not want to ruin the romance of the wedding by bringing them up. It is a very standard blanket power of attorney. It gives me the full legal authority to manage your healthcare directives and your trust fund assets only in the extreme event that you are deemed mentally or physically incapacitated. You just need to sign the bottom of page 7 and initial the financial disclosures on page 9. He handed me the silver pen. The metal was cold and heavy in my hand. I looked down at the documents, pretending to be completely overwhelmed by the legal jargon blurring the text with my fake tears. While David was entirely consumed by the intoxicating prospect of securing his $5 million bailout, I shifted my gaze slightly to the left. Marcus was standing near the intensive care double doors, watching us intently. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I gave him a barely perceptible nod. It was the signal we had established in the stairwell. I had successfully anchored David to the waiting room. I had successfully engaged the primary target with the paperwork. The board was officially set. Marcus turned seamlessly on his heel and walked away. He moved with silent athletic grace, sliding past the reception desk and slipping through the main hospital exit doors completely unnoticed by David or Sarah. Marcus was executing the second incredibly vital phase of our counterattack. He was a senior forensic financial analyst who spent his entire life working with high-level security clearance, investigating massive corporate fraud. He did not just crunch numbers, he knew exactly how to track physical evidence. More importantly, he had deep, established connections. During the wedding preparations, Marcus had recognized the specific security vendor the luxury hotel used for their ballroom surveillance cameras. It was a private high-end security firm run by a former federal investigator that Marcus had personally collaborated with on a massive embezzlement case 3 years ago. Marcus was walking out into the freezing Chicago rain, stepping into the dark, desolate hospital parking lot to make the most important phone call of his career. I could vividly picture him standing in the shadows, pulling his phone from his tailored suit jacket, dialing the private encrypted number of his security contact. He was operating on a severely restricted ticking clock. David was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. Once the initial shock of Barbara's hospitalization wore off, David would absolutely realize that the hotel surveillance cameras might have captured his mother tampering with the champagne glasses. He would inevitably dispatch someone to demand the hotel delete the footage, citing a massive family privacy crisis. Marcus had to secure that digital evidence before David's people even realized it existed. I knew Marcus was out there in the freezing rain, demanding his contact remotely access the hotel's secure server. I knew he was calling in every single professional favor he had ever earned, begging them to pull the 4K high-definition video feed from the head table spanning the exact 10-minute window before the toast. He was securing the undeniable absolute proof of Barbara's malicious premeditated crime. But I could not focus on Marcus right now. I had to keep David completely, utterly distracted. I had to buy Marcus the critical time he needed to download that security footage onto a secure flash drive. I looked down at the legal documents resting on my lap. My name was printed neatly across the top header in bold black ink. Jessica Marie Myers. He had already changed my last name on the paperwork, assuming absolute ownership over my identity. I gripped the silver pen tightly, forcing my hand to shake as I slowly turned the crisp white pages. David. This legal language is so incredibly dense, I whimpered, letting a fresh tear drop directly onto the edge of page 2. I do not understand what all of these clauses actually mean. It says here that you have the right to liquidate my legacy assets without secondary approval. Does that mean you can just empty my trust fund without telling me? David let out a soft, patronizing chuckle, placing a warm, heavy hand over mine to stop me from turning the pages. Jessica, sweetheart, you are overthinking this, he said, his voice thick with manipulative patience. That is just standard boilerplate legal protection. It simply means that if you are locked in a hospital room in a coma or suffering a severe psychological break, I can quickly move funds around to pay your massive medical bills without waiting for a judge to grant me permission. I would never touch your trust fund for any other reason. You know I make more than enough money in commercial real estate to support us both. We are perfectly secure. It was a brilliant, breathtakingly bold lie. He was staring directly into my eyes, assuring me of his immense wealth, while secretly suffocating under $3 million of toxic debt. He was a master manipulator, playing the role of the wealthy, successful provider to absolute perfection. I nodded slowly, wiping my nose with the back of my hand. I know you are successful, David. I said, my voice soft and compliant. I know you would never let anything bad happen to us. But I am just an actuary. My entire brain is literally wired to look for loopholes and catastrophic risks. If I am going to sign over my entire life to you tonight, I just need to make sure this document is absolutely ironclad. I need to know there are no legal vulnerabilities that a hospital administration could exploit to challenge your authority over me. David's smug smile faltered for a tiny fraction of a second. He did not like the word vulnerabilities. He wanted me to sign the paper blindly without reading the fine print. But he also knew he had to indulge my professional paranoia if he wanted to get my signature without raising any major red flags. What kind of vulnerabilities are you worried about, Jessica? He asked, his tone slipping into a slight edge of annoyance. My attorney is one of the best in Chicago. This document is completely airtight. I leaned forward, pointing a shaking finger at a blank space at the bottom of page 5. It does not have a comprehensive reciprocal asset validation clause, I said, pulling a highly complex specialized financial term completely out of thin air. In my corporate risk assessments, we always require a reciprocal asset validation clause when merging two high net worth portfolios. It simply states that before you can assume emergency control of my $5 million trust fund, your own personal family assets must be completely verified and audited to ensure you are not currently under any severe financial duress. It is a standard protective measure to prevent predatory financial abuse in sudden medical emergencies. David's face went completely blank. The color drained rapidly from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and hollow under the fluorescent hospital lights. He stared at the blank space on the paper, his mind violently calculating the absolute disaster I had just casually proposed. A comprehensive financial audit. If he signed a legal document demanding a forensic audit of his assets before he could touch my money, his entire $3 million bankruptcy would be instantly publicly exposed to the courts. It would completely destroy his entire scheme. "Jessica, that is completely unnecessary." He stammered, his voice suddenly tight and strained. "We do not need a corporate audit clause in a simple marital power of attorney document. That is just excessive bureaucratic red tape. It will slow down my ability to help you in a real emergency." I pulled the document back toward my chest, holding it tightly, playing the role of the stubborn, paranoid professional. "No, David," I insisted, my voice rising slightly in fake panic. "I have seen how these things work in the insurance industry. If the hospital administrators see that I am an orphaned woman with a massive trust fund, they will immediately suspect you are just after my money. They will challenge your power of attorney in probate court. They will lock my accounts in litigation for years. But if we add a simple handwritten rider demanding a full third-party audit of your flawless, pristine commercial real estate portfolio, it legally proves to the courts that you are independently wealthy and have absolutely no financial motive to exploit me. It makes your power over me completely undeniable." I was using his own massive ego directly against him. I was challenging his carefully constructed facade of wealth and success. If he refused to add the audit clause, he would have to admit that he did not actually want his finances examined. He would have to admit that his real estate portfolio was not flawless. He was completely trapped by his own lies. David stared at me, his jaw working furiously as he tried to find a way out of the legal maze I had just seamlessly built around him. He looked at the silver pen in my hand, and then he looked at the intensive care doors where his mother was currently fighting for her life. He needed my signature tonight. He desperately needed the legal authority to drain my accounts before the private lenders seized his family estate. He made the desperate, greedy calculation that he could sign the rider, now get my signature, and somehow figure out a way to bypass the audit later once I was securely locked away in a psychiatric ward. "Fine," he spat, his voice rough and angry. "If it will make you stop crying and just sign the damn paper, we will add your paranoid little corporate rider. Write it in." I uncapped the silver pen. I smoothed the legal document flat against my thigh. I began to write carefully, crafting the exact legal terminology required to trigger an immediate, irreversible third-party forensic financial audit of the entire Myers family estate, the exact second David attempted to execute this power of attorney. I was not just protecting myself. I was building a massive, unescapable financial bomb, and I was making my husband willingly light the fuse. The silver pen felt heavy in my hand. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room buzzed above us, emitting a low mechanical hum that seemed to match the rapid beating of my heart. I sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair, staring down at the legal document resting on my lap. The power of attorney form was printed on thick, expensive paper. It was a tangible representation of David's absolute betrayal. He had brought this document to our wedding. He had packed it in his briefcase while putting on his tuxedo. He had stood at the altar and promised to love and protect me while knowing this exact piece of paper was waiting to strip away my entire existence. In my profession as an actuary, we are trained to eliminate emotional bias from our equations. We look at the raw data. We assess the vulnerabilities. We build models that predict catastrophic failures before they happen. Right now, sitting next to the man who had actively conspired to induce a violent psychotic break in my mind, I was building the most critical model of my entire career. I had to draft a legal rider that sounded like the paranoid ramblings of a traumatized orphan, but functioned as a highly sophisticated financial guillotine. David was hovering over my right shoulder. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could smell the expensive cologne he wore mixed with the faint sour scent of his own nervous sweat. He was trying to project the image of a patient, comforting husband, but his physical proximity was suffocating. He was a predator waiting for the trap to snap shut. He believed he had already won. He believed the trauma of watching his mother collapse on the dance floor had completely broken my psychological defenses. He thought my tears were real. He thought my shaking hands were a symptom of a fragile mind collapsing under pressure. He had absolutely no idea that my trembling fingers were a calculated performance designed specifically to blind him to the lethal precision of the words I was about to write. I pressed the tip of the silver pen against the blank space at the bottom of the 5th page. I let out a loud, ragged breath, making sure David heard the sound of my manufactured panic. "David," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly on his name. "I am just so terrified that the hospital administration will challenge your authority. If I have a medical crisis and they see my $5 million trust fund, they will immediately freeze the accounts. They will force us into probate court. They will accuse you of financial exploitation. I cannot let them do that to you. I cannot let them take control of my medical care." David squeezed my shoulder, his fingers digging slightly into the torn silk of my wedding dress. "Jessica, you are overreacting," he said, his voice a low, soothing murmur that masked his burning impatience. "My lawyer drafted this document. It is completely standard. The hospital will not question it. We just need your signature so we are protected." "No!" I sobbed, shaking my head, and letting another fake tear fall onto the pristine paper. "Standard is not enough. You do not know how these institutions work, David. I grew up in the foster care system. I know exactly how fast the state will seize control of a vulnerable person. We have to make this document completely unassailable. We have to prove to the courts that you are acting entirely in good faith. I am adding a reciprocal fiduciary verification clause. It is the only way I will feel safe." I began to write. I kept my handwriting intentionally messy and erratic, mirroring my supposed emotional instability. But the legal terminology I employed was flawless. I titled the handwritten edition Emergency Fiduciary Asset Verification Rider. The premise I explained to David through my fake tears was simple. I told him this clause would force the hospital to recognize his immense personal wealth, thus proving he had no financial motive to exploit my trust fund. It sounded like a shield built to protect him. In reality, it was a devastating financial Trojan horse. The language I drafted explicitly stated that the activation of this power of attorney was strictly contingent upon an immediate, mandatory, and completely transparent forensic audit of the designated fiduciary's entire financial portfolio. The clause mandated that the moment David presented this document to any medical or financial institution to claim control over my assets, he simultaneously and irrevocably consented to a full third-party investigation of his personal and corporate accounts. By signing this document, he was legally authorizing a federal auditing firm to completely tear open his finances to verify his fiduciary standing. David and his mother were hiding $3 million in toxic commercial real estate debt. They were dodging aggressive private lenders. They were operating insolvent shell companies to mask their total financial ruin. They desperately needed my $5 million to quietly erase that debt before the bankruptcy became public and destroyed their elite Chicago social standing. But the writer I was currently writing dictated that before David could touch a single penny of my money, his entire fraudulent financial empire would be exposed to the blinding light of a federal audit. The very document he needed to steal my wealth would automatically trigger the absolute public destruction of his own. It was a beautiful, inescapable paradox. He could not access my trust fund without exposing his bankruptcy. And if his bankruptcy was exposed, the courts would instantly revoke his fiduciary authority over my assets. I watched David out of the corner of my eye as I filled the blank space with dense legal text. He was staring at the paper, but he was not truly reading the words. His mind was entirely consumed by the $5 million finish line. He saw my messy handwriting. He heard my desperate sobbing. He saw a broken orphaned girl desperately trying to create a sense of safety by throwing bureaucratic red tape at a terrifying situation. His profound arrogance completely blinded him to the reality of the situation. He genuinely believed that someone from my background could never outsmart a man born into his level of generational wealth and privilege. He assumed he could simply sign the document, humor my paranoid delusion for the night, and then hire his expensive family lawyers to bypass the handwritten clause in the morning, once I was heavily sedated in a locked psychiatric ward. He was so blinded by his own toxic greed that he was willingly placing his head directly onto the chopping block. While I was meticulously building David's cage, Marcus was executing a masterpiece of psychological warfare on the opposite side of the waiting room. I kept my head bowed over the legal document, but I tracked their movements through the reflection of the glass observation windows. Sarah was pacing near a row of vending machines. Her emerald green designer gown looked absurdly out of place against the sterile linoleum floor. Her face was set in a hard, unforgiving mask. She was entirely unconcerned about her mother fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. Her only concern was the $3 million debt threatening to obliterate her family name. She had just blackmailed her own husband, threatening to frame me for poisoning Barbara unless Marcus signed over his entire life savings to bail out her bankrupt brother. Marcus walked slowly toward her. For a man who usually radiated towering absolute confidence, he looked perfectly defeated. His broad shoulders were slumped, his posture was heavy and resigned. He was carrying a thick manila folder he had pulled from his briefcase. He was putting on a performance that rivaled my own, playing the broken husband surrendering to his ruthless, manipulative wife. This was the most critical synchronization of our two-front war. If Sarah suspected for a single second that Marcus was stalling or fighting back, she would immediately march over to the police officers stationed near the front desk and accuse me of attempted murder. Marcus had to keep her completely isolated, entirely distracted, and utterly convinced of her own absolute victory. I watched as Marcus stopped in front of Sarah. He did not say a word. He simply held out the manila folder. Sarah snatched it from his hands with the speed and aggression of a starving predator. She ripped open the flap and pulled out a dense stack of legal papers. From my vantage point across the room, I could see the title printed in bold black letters: Irrevocable Transfer of Assets and Retirement Portfolios. It was exactly what she had demanded in the stairwell. It was the total surrender of Marcus's $2.8 million in personal wealth. Sarah's entire demeanor shifted the moment she saw the title. The hard, tense lines of her face completely relaxed into a sickening, triumphant smile. She did not look at her husband with an ounce of gratitude or love. She looked at the documents the way David had looked at my trust fund. She was looking at a massive unearned payout. She immediately flipped past the first few pages, ignoring the complex legal structuring, ignoring the dense paragraphs of indemnification clauses, skipping straight to the final page to verify that Marcus had actually signed his name on the dotted line. What Sarah did not know was that the document in her hands was a complete elaborate forensic fabrication. Marcus was a senior financial analyst who spent his career dismantling white-collar fraud and drafting airtight asset recovery protocols for federal investigations. He knew exactly how to construct a legal document that looked incredibly intimidating and perfectly valid on the surface, but was fundamentally structurally void upon closer inspection. The asset transfer agreement he had just handed to his wife was riddled with deliberate fatal legal contradictions. Marcus had intentionally embedded conflicting jurisdictional clauses, ensuring that the document claimed authority in two different states, simultaneously rendering it completely unenforceable in a court of law. He had included deeply buried indemnification paragraphs that explicitly stated the transfer of funds was contingent upon the receiving party, assuming total liability for any and all future criminal investigations related to the assets. He had even subtly altered the routing numbers of his primary investment accounts, invalidating any attempted wire transfers before they could even be initiated. It was a masterpiece of financial sabotage. It was a document designed to keep a greedy, arrogant woman completely occupied reading the exact words she wanted to read, while entirely missing the reality that the paper she was holding was absolutely worthless. Sarah stood by the vending machines, flipping through the pages, her eyes completely glued to the numbers. She was so entirely consumed by her perceived victory over her husband that she did not look up once. She did not check on the police officers. She did not look toward the intensive care unit. And most importantly, she did not look across the waiting room to see what David and I were doing. She was perfectly isolated in her own bubble of toxic triumph. I turned my attention back to my own task. I had reached the end of the handwritten rider. I added one final devastating sentence to the bottom of the page. I stipulated that any attempt to alter, bypass, or legally challenge the mandatory forensic audit clause would immediately and permanently nullify the entire power of attorney, rendering David's fiduciary status completely void. I had locked the cage. I had welded the door shut. There was absolutely no way for him to touch my inheritance without dragging his entire fraudulent bankrupt empire into the harsh, unforgiving light of a federal investigation. I let the silver pen slip from my trembling fingers. It clattered against the plastic armrest of the waiting room chair. I let out a long, shaky exhale, leaning my head back against the wall, playing the part of a woman who had just expended the very last ounce of her emotional energy. "It is done, David." I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the hospital ventilation system. "I wrote the protection clause. If something happens to my mind, you are the only one who can access my accounts. But you have to sign the bottom of the rider to acknowledge that you accept the fiduciary transparency requirements." David did not even hesitate. He did not ask to read the paragraph I had just spent 5 minutes carefully drafting. He did not question the complex legal terminology I had used. His eyes were entirely locked on the blank signature line at the bottom of the page. He was staring at the keys to a $5 million vault. He reached down, picking up the silver pen I had dropped. His hand brushed against mine, and his skin was hot and clammy with greedy anticipation. He smiled down at me, projecting the image of a loving, devoted partner. "Thank you, Jessica," he murmured, his voice smooth and incredibly deceptive. "I promise I will take perfect care of everything. You never have to worry about a single thing ever again. I will handle it all." He pressed the pen to the paper. I watched the dark black ink flow from the tip, tracing the elegant, practiced loops of his signature. David James Myers. He signed his name with absolute, unhesitating confidence. He crossed his letters and sealed his own complete financial destruction. He handed the thick legal packet back to me, his chest swelling with the arrogant pride of a man who believed he had just pulled off the perfect crime. He believed he had successfully manipulated a broken orphan into handing over her entire fortune. He believed he was walking out of this hospital a multimillionaire. I took the documents from his hand, pulling them safely against my chest. I lowered my head, allowing a small, dark smile to touch my lips, hidden completely from his view by the curtain of my messy hair. He had no idea what he had just done. He had no idea that while his mother was lying in a hospital bed fighting a self-inflicted psychotic break, he had just formally, legally, and irrevocably signed the death warrant for his entire family's elite Chicago empire. The financial Trojan horse was officially inside the city walls, and the real war was finally about to begin. The harsh overhead speaker in the intensive care waiting area clicked alive, emitting a brief burst of static before a sharp voice requested David to report to room 4 immediately. The waiting was over. The chemical compound had finally run its course through Barbara's system. I stood up slowly, clutching the thick stack of altered legal documents to my chest, making sure my hands trembled just enough for David to notice. He jumped from his plastic chair, his face tight with a mixture of exhaustion and desperate anticipation. He reached out and grabbed my arm, guiding me down the sterile, brightly lit corridor toward his mother's room. He was walking entirely too fast for a man whose mother had just nearly died. He was walking with the aggressive, urgent pace of a man who needed to secure a $5 million payday before the clock struck midnight. We pushed through this heavy wooden door of room 4. The intensive care unit was a symphony of rhythmic mechanical beeping and the sharp smell of medical-grade sanitizers. Barbara was lying in the center of a narrow hospital bed. She looked absolutely nothing like the pristine, wealthy matriarch who had spent the last 2 years treating me like an uninvited pest. Her custom designer silk gown was torn and stained from her violent thrashing on the ballroom floor. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled, chaotic mess spread across the thin hospital pillow. The heavy stage makeup she had worn for the wedding was smeared down her cheeks, making her look hollowed out and incredibly frail. But the moment the heavy door clicked shut behind us, her eyes snapped open. There was no grogginess in her gaze. There was no lingering confusion from the massive dose of the hallucinogenic sedative she had unknowingly ingested. There was only stark, immediate terror. Her eyes darted wildly around the sterile room, searching for the invisible threats that had broken her mind an hour ago. Then her frantic gaze locked onto me. I was standing just behind David, projecting the perfect image of a terrified, weeping bride. I let a fresh tear roll down my cheek and offered her a weak, trembling smile. I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. She saw me standing perfectly upright. She saw that my mind was entirely intact. She saw that I was completely, absolutely sane. The trap had failed. Her calculated malicious plan to induce a violent public psychotic break in her new daughter-in-law had ended with her strapped to a hospital bed while her son's bankruptcy loomed just hours away. Her breathing hitched violently, causing the heart monitor next to her bed to spike into a rapid warning rhythm. David rushed to her side, grabbing her hand and leaning over the metal bed rail. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with a fake desperate relief. "You are awake. You had a terrible allergic reaction at the reception. You collapsed on the dance floor." Barbara did not care about his carefully constructed cover story. She grabbed the collar of his wrinkled tuxedo shirt with a surprising amount of desperate physical strength, pulling him down until his ear was practically touching her mouth. She did not look at him. Her eyes remained completely locked onto mine, burning with a dark, venomous panic. "Why is she fine?" Barbara hissed, her voice a harsh, ragged whisper that scraped against the quiet hum of the medical machines. "Why is she standing there, David?" "The plan failed. We are out of time. You need to get the papers signed right now. Do it immediately. Do not wait for the morning." David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. He gently pried his mother's gripping fingers off his collar, casting a quick, nervous glance back at me to see if I had heard her desperate commands. I simply tilted my head and let out a soft, confused whimper, playing the role of the oblivious, frightened girl to absolute perfection. "I have it handled, Mom," David whispered back, his voice tight with suppressed anxiety. "Jessica has agreed to sign the emergency power of attorney. We are finalizing the documents tonight. Everything is going to be fine. We just need to get you stabilized and discharged." Before Barbara could respond, the heavy wooden door of the intensive care room swung open again. The attending physician strode in, followed closely by two stern-looking nurses. The doctor carried a digital tablet and wore an expression of absolute unyielding medical authority. "Mrs. Myers," he began, his tone completely flat and professional, "I am glad to see you are regaining consciousness. However, your toxicology report indicates a massive exposure to a highly dangerous illicit synthetic compound. Your cardiovascular system has sustained a severe shock. We need to keep you here for at least 48 hours for continuous cardiac monitoring and a mandatory psychiatric evaluation." Barbara sat straight up in the hospital bed, completely ignoring the tangle of intravenous tubes connected to the back of her hand. "Absolutely not!" She snapped, her voice suddenly, regaining a fraction of its usual wealthy elite arrogance. "I am leaving this hospital right now. I have urgent family business to attend to. Unhook these machines immediately." The physician crossed his arms, stepping closer to the bed. "Ma'am, you are in a highly precarious medical state. Discharging yourself right now could trigger a secondary cardiac event. It is medically negligent for me to allow you to walk out of these doors. Furthermore, given the nature of the substance found in your blood, we are legally obligated to conduct a thorough evaluation to ensure you are not a danger to yourself or others." I watched the panic explode across David's face. If the hospital insisted on keeping Barbara for a mandatory psychiatric hold, it would completely derail their timeline. They needed to execute the power of attorney tonight. They needed my $5 million trust fund to quietly erase their $3 million of toxic commercial debt before the banks opened on Monday morning. If Barbara was locked in a psychiatric evaluation, David would be trapped here, dealing with the hospital administration and the police instead of securing his financial bailout. "We know our rights," David interrupted, stepping aggressively between the doctor and his mother. "My mother is a prominent citizen of Chicago. She is fully conscious and entirely capable of making her own medical decisions. If she wants to leave, you cannot legally hold her here against her will. Bring us the discharge papers immediately. We are leaving against medical advice." The doctor stared at David, his expression hardening into pure medical disdain. "If you force her to leave this facility right now, Mr. Myers, you are taking her life into your own hands. I will print the against medical advice forms, but I want it explicitly documented that you are acting against direct professional counsel." "Do it," David barked, pointing a shaking finger at the door. "And bring us a wheelchair. We are leaving." The next 20 minutes were a suffocating blur of aggressive tension and chaotic hospital bureaucracy. I stood quietly in the corner of the room, clutching the legal documents against my chest, watching the wealthy elite Chicago family completely unravel. Barbara ripped the intravenous line out of her own hand before the nurse could even untape it, leaving a small trail of blood running down her knuckles. She refused the hospital scrubs offering, instead wrapping a thin gray blanket around her ruined silk designer gown. She looked like a defeated broken monarch refusing to surrender her crown. David paced the small room, his eyes constantly darting toward the clock on the wall. It was approaching 11 at night. The window of opportunity was closing rapidly. He needed to get me in front of a licensed legal notary before midnight to ensure the power of attorney was officially executed on the exact date of our wedding, making it an undeniable component of our new marital union. He snatched the against medical advice forms from the returning nurse, signing his name with violent, jagged strokes. A young orderly brought a standard hospital wheelchair into the room. David practically lifted his mother out of the bed, dropping her roughly into the leather seat. She winced in pain, but kept her mouth shut, her eyes locked firmly on the door. "Let us go," David commanded, grabbing the handles of the wheelchair and pushing it forcefully out into the bright, sterile corridor. "Come on, Jessica. Stay close to me." I scurried after them, forcing my breathing to remain shallow and terrified. The walk from the intensive care unit down to the main hospital lobby felt like a surreal, terrifying march toward an execution. The rhythmic squeaking of the wheelchair tires echoed loudly against the linoleum floors. We passed bewildered night shift nurses and exhausted doctors who stared openly at the bizarre procession. A ruined, wealthy matriarch in a wheelchair, pushed by a frantic, sweating groom, followed closely by a weeping bride in a torn custom wedding dress clutching a stack of legal papers. As the elevator doors opened onto the expansive ground floor hospital lobby, the sheer, suffocating tension in the air became almost a tangible physical weight. The lobby was mostly empty at this hour, cast in dim, moody lighting, contrasting sharply with the harsh, bright lights of the emergency bays. The rain was lashing violently against the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, matching the chaotic storm brewing inside the building. Standing near the rotating glass entrance doors was a woman I had never seen before. She was tall, incredibly thin, and wore a sharp-tailored charcoal suit that screamed expensive corporate litigation. She was clutching a sleek black leather briefcase and tapping her designer heel impatiently against the tile floor. As we approached, she stepped forward, her cold, calculating eyes sweeping over Barbara's ruined appearance and David's frantic state before locking instantly onto the legal documents clutched tightly against my chest. This was attorney Patricia Collins. David had summoned her while I was pretending to cry in the waiting room. She was not a standard ethical legal professional. She was a high-priced aggressive fixer for elite Chicago families, a woman who specialized in pushing through questionable documents, silencing messy liabilities, and stamping official legal seals onto highly unethical demands. She was the final piece of David's predatory trap. Patricia, David said, his voice practically shaking with relief as he pushed the wheelchair toward her. "Thank you for coming so quickly. We had a massive medical emergency with my mother tonight. It has been incredibly traumatic for my new wife. We need to execute the emergency legal protections right now while everyone is still together." Attorney Collins did not offer a single word of sympathy or concern for Barbara's obvious physical distress. She simply nodded, pulling a heavy brass notary stamp and a leather-bound ledger from her briefcase. "I have the documents David sent over earlier this evening," she said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any human emotion. "I understand the bride is highly distressed. We can handle this quietly right here in the lobby lounge. There is a private conference table around the corner." She turned her sharp, predatory gaze directly onto me. Her eyes were completely dead, analyzing me not as a person, but as a minor legal obstacle that needed to be smoothly bypassed. "You must be Jessica," she said, extending a cold, bony hand. "I am Patricia. I handle all of the complex estate planning for the Myers family. David told me you are feeling very vulnerable tonight. Do not worry, my dear. Once you sign these papers, you will never have to worry about managing complex financial or medical decisions ever again. David will take on that entire heavy burden for you." I stared at her extended hand intentionally, letting my own hand shake violently as I slowly reached out to take it. She gripped my fingers with surprising strength, pulling me slightly forward like a spider reeling in a fly. I knew exactly what she was. She was the bureaucratic enforcer of their cruelty, She was the one who would stamp the legal seal on the theft of my $5 million inheritance and turn my life over to a man who wanted me locked in a psychiatric ward. "Thank you, Patricia," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I just want to feel safe. I just want David to protect me." David let out a heavy, exhaled breath of pure, greedy victory. He placed a hand on the small of my back, guiding me away from the main entrance and toward a secluded, dimly lit seating area tucked behind a massive indoor waterfall display. The sound of the rushing water masked our conversation perfectly, isolating us entirely from the few remaining hospital staff members milling around the reception desks. Barbara sat silently in her wheelchair, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She was watching me with an intensity that burned through the dim lighting. She was waiting for the final absolute confirmation that her violent, malicious plan had successfully secured their financial salvation. She was waiting for the ink to dry. Attorney Collins placed her expensive leather briefcase onto the polished glass surface of the small conference table. She clicked the brass latches open, the sound echoing sharply over the ambient noise of the waterfall. She pulled out a pristine, uncreased copy of the exact same power of attorney document David had handed me upstairs. She clicked a heavy gold fountain pen and placed it deliberately next to the signature line. "I need the copy you reviewed upstairs, Jessica," David said, his voice urgent and strained. "We need to make sure the writer you requested is formally attached before Patricia stamps the seal. Hand it to me." I clutched the stack of papers tighter against my chest, stepping back slightly, simulating a sudden spike of severe panic. "No!" I cried out softly, shaking my head. "I want to use my copy. I wrote the protection clause in my own handwriting. It makes me feel safer. I need to know the exact words I wrote are the ones being legally filed." David gritted his teeth, his patience completely eroding under the immense pressure of the ticking clock. It was exactly 11:45 at night. He had 15 minutes to secure his total absolute victory. "Fine," he snapped, snatching the gold pen from the table and shoving it into my trembling hand. "Use your copy. Just put it on the table and sign the bottom line, Jessica. We are all exhausted. We need to go home." I slowly lowered the thick legal document onto the glass table. I smoothed the wrinkled edges with my left hand, keeping my right hand hovering over the signature line. I looked down at the paper. I looked at the blank space where I was supposed to sign away my autonomy, my freedom, and my massive $5 million inheritance. I looked up. The suffocating tension in the hospital lobby reached a terrifying absolute peak. David was leaning over the table, his breath hot and ragged, his eyes completely dilated with pure, unchecked greed. Barbara was leaning forward in her wheelchair, her torn dress dragging on the floor, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of victorious anticipation. Attorney Collins stood over me, holding her heavy brass notary stamp perfectly poised to make the absolute theft of my life entirely legal and binding. They were completely, utterly convinced that they had won. They thought they had successfully broken a vulnerable, traumatized orphan. They thought they had easily outsmarted a woman who did not belong in their elite, wealthy world. They thought the game was completely over. I gripped the cold, heavy gold fountain pen in my hand, letting the terrified, weeping facade slip away from my mind one agonizing second at a time. I was no longer a victim trapped in a corner. I was an actuary standing at the absolute center of a perfectly constructed, flawlessly executed, catastrophic risk event. And it was finally time to watch their entire fraudulent, bankrupt empire burn straight to the ground. The heavy gold fountain pen lay on the polished glass surface of the hospital conference table, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights overhead like a glowing beacon of my impending destruction. The room was suffocatingly small. It smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and the sharp, sour tang of David's nervous perspiration. He was hovering just inches behind my right shoulder, his breath hot and ragged against my neck. His entire body vibrated with a toxic, frantic energy. He was staring at the blank signature line at the bottom of the power of attorney document, with a hunger so profound it was almost animalistic. Across the table, Barbara sat slumped in her hospital wheelchair, her ruined custom silk gown pooling around the metal footrests. Her face was pale and drawn from the massive chemical shock her system had just endured, but her eyes were bright with a sickening, victorious gleam. She offered me a weak, trembling grin. It was the smile of a predator watching the trap finally snap shut around its prey. Attorney Patricia Collins stood rigidly beside the table, clutching her brass notary stamp. Her cold, calculating eyes completely devoid of human empathy, waiting to legally validate the absolute theft of my life. I stared down at the crisp white paper. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the tension in the room to build to a terrifying, agonizing peak. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I could hear David's shallow, greedy breathing. For 2 solid hours, I had played the role of the hysterical, broken victim. I had manufactured tears, I had trembled. I had allowed them to believe they had successfully shattered my mind. But sitting in that chair, looking at the legal instrument designed to drain my $5 million inheritance and lock me in a psychiatric ward, the terrified orphan completely vanished. The brilliant analytical actuary took total control. I slowly reached out my right hand. I did not pick up the gold pen. I placed my index finger against the smooth metal barrel, and with one deliberate fluid motion, I slid it backward across the glass table. It made a sharp, continuous scraping sound before coming to a complete stop directly in front of Attorney Collins. "I do not think I will be signing this tonight," I said. My voice did not shake. It did not waver. It was completely calm, perfectly pitched, and entirely devoid of the hysterical panic I had been projecting for the past 2 hours. It was the voice of a woman negotiating a hostile corporate merger. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Their brains simply could not process the sudden radical shift in my demeanor. David blinked rapidly, stepping back from my chair as if he had just been physically struck. He stared at the back of my head, his face twisting into a mask of pure, bewildered confusion. "Jessica, what are you doing?" he demanded, his voice tight and strained, trying to maintain his soothing husbandly facade while raw panic bled through his tone. "You are exhausted. You are not thinking clearly. Just pick up the pen and sign the document so we can go home. We need to secure these protections right now." I ignored him completely. I slowly unclasped the small beaded bridal purse resting on my lap. The snap of the metal closure echoed loudly in the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out a sleek silver USB flash drive, placing it gently onto the glass table right next to the rejected power of attorney. Barbara's weak, triumphant grin instantly evaporated. She gripped the armrest of her wheelchair, her knuckles turning stark white, as a new, completely different kind of terror began to dawn in her eyes. Attorney Collins took a slow, deliberate step backward, her self-preservation instincts kicking in as she realized the dynamic in the room had just violently shifted. Right on cue, the heavy wooden door of the private conference room clicked open. The sound made David physically jump. Marcus stepped into the room, shutting the door firmly behind him. He did not look like a man who had just surrendered his life savings to a blackmailing wife. He looked like a federal prosecutor stepping into a courtroom with an airtight conviction. His tailored suit was slightly damp from the Chicago rain, but his posture was towering, commanding, and utterly immovable. He did not say a single word to David or Barbara. He simply walked directly to the table, picked up the silver flash drive, and turned toward the massive flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the conference room used for hospital administrative presentations. "Marcus, what the hell are you doing here?" David shouted, his voice finally breaking into open aggressive panic. "Get out of this room. This is private legal family business. You have absolutely no right to be in here." Marcus ignored him completely. He reached up and plugged the flash drive into the side port of the television. He grabbed the remote control resting on the credenza and pressed the power button. David lunged forward, his hands outstretched ready to physically rip the drive from the wall. "You turn that off right now," David roared, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. Marcus stepped effortlessly into David's path, blocking him with his massive athletic frame. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood there, an immovable brick wall of pure authority. "I suggest you sit down." "David," Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated with absolute, unyielding control. "You are going to want to see this." The large screen flickered to life, illuminating the dark conference room with a bright, crisp digital glow. The high-definition 4K security footage from the luxury hotel ballroom began to play. The camera angle was perfect, positioned securely above the grand chandelier, offering a flawless, unobstructed aerial view of the entire head table. The timestamp in the bottom right corner displayed the exact sequence of events, clearly establishing the timeline just 10 minutes before the wedding toasts began. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the television speakers. On the screen, the digital version of David was walking away from the table to speak with his groomsmen. The digital version of me was engaged in a conversation with a bridesmaid, facing entirely away from my place setting. And there, sitting in the center of the frame, was Barbara. We watched in crystal clear, high-definition clarity as Barbara casually checked her surroundings. We watched her open her expensive designer clutch. We watched her pull out a small glass vial. And then with horrifying, undeniable, deliberate precision, we watched her reach across the pristine white tablecloth and tap a stream of fine white powder directly into my crystal champagne flute. The camera resolution was so incredibly sharp you could actually see the powder dissolving into the sparkling liquid. No! Barbara gasped, a raw, guttural sound of pure animal terror tearing from her throat. She pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide and bulging as she watched her own malicious felony play out on the massive screen. "Turn it off!" David screamed, his voice cracking with absolute total desperation. He threw his weight against Marcus, trying to claw his way toward the television. "It is fake. It is digitally altered. Turn the damn screen off, Marcus." Marcus easily shoved David backward, forcing him to stumble and crash heavily into the vinyl waiting chairs. "It is a direct secure download from the hotel's encrypted security server," David Marcus stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I pulled it personally 15 minutes ago. It is time-stamped, verified, and legally admissible in any federal court in this country. There is no denying it. Your mother intentionally premeditated a violent poisoning." Attorney Collins was already moving. I watched her out of the corner of my eye as she swiftly, entirely silently grabbed her heavy brass notary stamp and shoved it back into her leather briefcase. She was a corrupt fixer, but she was not suicidal. She was looking at undeniable video evidence of a major felony offense, and she knew instantly that her highly lucrative legal career was standing on the absolute edge of total annihilation. She backed away from the table, moving toward the door, desperate to completely sever her physical and professional ties to the Myers family. "You are not going anywhere, Patricia," I said, my voice slicing through the chaos like a razor blade. I turned in my chair, fixing her with a cold, dead stare. "If you walk out that door, I will personally ensure your name is explicitly tied to the conspiracy to commit fraud. You will stay exactly where you are." Patricia froze, her hand hovering just inches from the brass doorknob. She slowly turned back around, her face completely ashen, realizing she was completely trapped. David scrambled up from the chairs, his chest heaving, his tuxedo shirt torn and soaked with sweat. "You cannot prove anything," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me, Marcus, and the television screen. My mother was confused. "She made a mistake. You are my wife, Jessica. You cannot use this against us. You signed the power of attorney. You gave me the legal authority to handle this. You signed the rider." I slowly stood up from the conference table. I smoothed down the ruined silk of my wedding gown, standing to my full height, looking at the man who had tried to steal my mind. "I did sign the rider, David," I said, my voice ringing with cold actuarial precision. "But you clearly did not read a single word of the legal terminology I actually wrote. You were so blinded by your own toxic predatory greed that you blindly authorized your own total financial execution." David stopped breathing. His jaw went completely slack. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, the first genuine note of absolute terror bleeding into his voice. I picked up the power of attorney document from the glass table, holding it up under the fluorescent lights. "You thought I was a terrified orphan desperately seeking a protective bureaucratic shield," I explained, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You thought I was trying to legally protect you from hospital administrators. But that clause does not grant you access to my $5 million trust fund, David. It explicitly, irrevocably, and immediately triggers a mandatory third-party forensic audit of the entire Myers family financial portfolio the exact second this document is executed." Barbara let out a sharp, wheezing gasp, gripping her chest, as her heart monitor in the other room had likely warned her of this exact stress. David's face lost every single trace of color, transforming into a sickening shade of gray. "You authorized a federal review, David." I continued, my voice relentless and completely unforgiving. By demanding my signature tonight, you legally consented to open your books, which is a fascinating strategic choice for a man who is currently hiding $3 million in toxic commercial real estate debt. The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. David stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the glass table. How he gasped, his voice barely audible. How could you possibly know about the debt? Because you left your private ledgers sitting in an unsecured home office. While you were busy trying to orchestrate my psychological destruction, I stated, gesturing toward Marcus. We have the spreadsheets, David. We have the records of the insolvent shell companies. We have the default notices from the unregulated private lenders. We know you are facing aggressive foreclosure. We know your entire elite Chicago empire is a hollow, bankrupt lie. David looked like he was going to vomit. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his entire body shaking violently. He was looking at the absolute total collapse of his entire world. The polished, wealthy real estate developer was gone, replaced by a pathetic, desperate fraud who had just been completely outmaneuvered. But you cannot use them, he stammered, a frantic, desperate attempt to cling to his wife's earlier blackmail. Sarah knows. She knows you poisoned my mother. If you expose the finances, Sarah will go to the police and tell them you slipped the drug into the glass. She will ruin you, Jessica. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just checkmate her opponent in 3 moves. Sarah is currently standing in the lobby holding a completely fabricated, legally void asset transfer agreement that Marcus drafted on a napkin in the stairwell. I said, watching the last remaining shred of hope completely die in David's eyes. She thinks she has secured $2 million of his retirement funds. She is entirely distracted. But more importantly, David, Sarah's blackmail only works if there is no video evidence proving exactly who dropped the powder into the glass. I pointed at the massive television screen where the digital image of his mother committing a felony was paused in high-definition glory. The police will not care about Sarah's fabricated witness testimony when I hand them this flash drive. Your sister has absolutely no leverage left. Your mother is caught dead to rights on camera committing an aggressive, violent felony. Your legal fixer is trapped in this room as a witness. And you are holding a power of attorney document that legally mandates the exposure of your massive unpayable debt. David fell to his knees. The wealthy, arrogant predator actually dropped to the cold linoleum floor of the hospital conference room. He stared up at me, tears of genuine, devastating panic streaming down his face. Jessica, please, he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. Please do not do this. I am your husband. We can fix this. I will annul the marriage. I will sign whatever you want. Please do not give those financial ledgers to the authorities. The private lenders will destroy my family. They will take everything we have left. Please, you have to keep the finances a secret. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no empathy, no pity, and no remorse. I looked at the man who had planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward so he could steal the only security I had ever known. I cannot keep it a secret, David, I said, my voice completely flat and devastatingly final. Because I hit send on an encrypted email exactly 5 minutes ago while you were running down the hallway to get the notary. Your entire financial ledger, every single spreadsheet, every default notice, and the absolute proof of your impending bankruptcy has already been delivered directly to my personal legal team. David let out a loud, racking sob, burying his face in his hands. Barbara was weeping openly in her wheelchair, completely broken and destroyed. And just to be absolutely thorough, I added, turning toward the heavy wooden door to leave them in the ruins of their own making. I also forwarded the entire digital package to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Enjoy the audit, David. The heavy silence in the hospital conference room was so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on our chests. The digital image of Barbara committing a felony remained paused on the massive television screen, bathing the room in a harsh artificial glow. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. We were all trapped in a suspended animation of absolute ruin. Then the survival instincts of the wealthy and desperate finally kicked in. I watched the exact moment David decided that saving his own skin was vastly more important than protecting the woman who gave birth to him. He slowly pushed himself off the cold linoleum floor, his tuxedo completely ruined his face. twisted into a mask of frantic self-preservation. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Attorney Collins, who was still frozen by the door, clutching her briefcase like a shield. "Patricia, you have to listen to me," David pleaded, his voice vibrating with a pathetic, desperate energy. "I had absolutely nothing to do with that video. You are looking at the screen. You can see it for yourself. My mother acted entirely alone. I am just as shocked as you are right now. I thought she just had a sudden medical emergency. I had absolutely no idea she brought illicit narcotics to my wedding. She must have lost her mind under the financial stress. She has been incredibly unstable for months. You have to believe me, Patricia. I am completely innocent in this." Barbara let out a sound that was half gasp and half primal scream. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly I thought her fragile bones might snap under the immense pressure. The betrayal hit her with the brutal force of a freight train. She had risked a federal prison sentence to save her golden boy from bankruptcy, and he was throwing her directly to the wolves before the ink on his fake apologies was even dry. "How dare you!" Barbara shrieked, her voice a ragged, terrifying screech that echoed violently off the glass walls. "You ungrateful, cowardly little boy! You are going to stand there and blame me for this. You are going to pretend your hands are perfectly clean." She turned her wild, furious eyes toward me and Marcus, pointing a shaking finger directly at her son. "He bought the drug," she yelled, spit flying from her lips as she completely abandoned any shred of maternal loyalty. "Do not let him lie to you, Jessica." David spent weeks searching the dark web. He used an encrypted browser on his private office computer. He paid for the chemical compound using a prepaid anonymous credit card. He bought 3 towns over so it could never be traced back to his name. He calculated the exact dosage based on your body weight. He told me exactly when to drop it into your glass. He orchestrated every single second of this nightmare to steal your money. David lunged toward his mother, his hands raised in a threatening gesture. "Shut your mouth, you crazy old bat," he roared, his charming, sophisticated facade completely shattering into a million jagged pieces. "You are hallucinating. You are still high on your own supply. Nobody is going to believe a word you say." Before David could reach her, the heavy wooden door burst open again. Sarah stormed into the center of the room. Her emerald green designer gown swished violently around her ankles as she stepped aggressively between her mother and her brother. "You are both acting like hysterical idiots, and you are loudly incriminating yourselves in front of hostile witnesses," she screamed, pushing David back by his shoulders. "Stop talking right now." Sarah was breathing heavily, her flawless high society mask cracking under the immense pressure of their collective stupidity. She looked at me with a gaze full of pure, absolute venom. "You think you are so brilliant, Jessica," she spat, her voice shaking with unchecked rage. "You think sending a few spreadsheets to the authorities is going to destroy us. You are a naive little orphan who got lucky. You are completely forgetting one massive detail. I still hold all the leverage." She spun around to face Marcus, holding up the thick manila folder she had snatched from him in the waiting room just moments ago. "We do not need your pathetic trust fund anymore, you stupid girl," Sarah mocked, waving the folder in the air. "My husband just signed over $2.8 million of his private retirement assets to the family holding account. With his money and our remaining liquid capital, we will pay off the toxic debt before the Internal Revenue Service even assigns an auditor to the case. We will settle the loans, we will bury this entire ridiculous scandal, and we will crush you in divorce court." Marcus did not flinch. He did not step back. He stood incredibly tall. His broad shoulders relaxed, his face, a mask of cold, unyielding forensic authority. He looked at his wife with a potent mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. "You really should have read those documents carefully, Sarah," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded total silence in the chaotic room. "You were so incredibly eager to steal my life savings to bail out your brother that you completely ignored the structural integrity of the asset transfer." Sarah froze, her triumphant, malicious smile faltering. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, clutching the folder tighter against her chest as a shadow of doubt crossed her eyes. "I watched you sign the final page. I saw your signature. You signed the legal document." Marcus nodded slowly, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "I did sign it," he confirmed. "But I also drafted it, Sarah. I spent 15 years investigating complex financial fraud and structuring airtight legal protocols for federal agencies. Do you honestly believe I would just hand over my entire financial portfolio on a single sheet of paper without a massive fight? He gestured toward the folder in her hands. I embedded 3 completely contradictory jurisdictional clauses directly into the primary transfer language. I intentionally altered the routing numbers for every single one of my investment accounts, rendering any wire transfer physically impossible. And I included a deeply buried indemnification paragraph stating that by accepting these funds, the receiving party assumes total absolute criminal liability for any subsequent federal investigations into the Myers estate. The color drained entirely from Sarah's face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin under the harsh fluorescent hospital lights. She ripped the documents out of the folder, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with sudden frantic desperation, her hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. The document you are holding in your hands, Sarah, is completely legally void. Marcus continued, his tone absolutely relentless and unforgiving. It is a masterpiece of financial sabotage. It is totally worthless. You have absolutely nothing. You have no leverage. You have no bailout. And you have just actively participated in a documented conspiracy to extort a federal investigator. Sarah let the document slip from her trembling fingers. The thick stack of papers fluttered to the floor, scattering across the sterile linoleum like dead leaves in winter. She stared at Marcus, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. Her mind could simply not process the absolute totality of her defeat. Marcus reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single pristine white envelope. He tossed it casually onto the glass conference table, right next to David's ruined power of attorney document. And those, Marcus said, pointing at the envelope, are the expedited divorce papers my attorney filed electronically 20 minutes ago. I am completely legally severing myself from this toxic, bankrupt bloodline. You are entirely on your own, Sarah. Enjoy the audit. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy Chicago dynasty shattered instantly and violently right in front of my eyes. The carefully maintained masks of high society elegance evaporated, leaving behind nothing but desperate feral animals fighting over the absolute scraps of a ruined empire. Sarah let out a piercing, hysterical scream and lunged at her brother, slapping David viciously across the chest. "This is all your fault," she shrieked, her voice echoing terribly in the small, confined room. "You and your stupid, greedy real estate flips. You dragged us into this massive black hole, and now you have completely destroyed my marriage. You promised me this would work. You promised me we would be safe." David shoved his sister backward with brutal force, his face contorted in ugly, furious rage. "Do not touch me, Sarah!" He roared, his hands balling into tight, aggressive fists. "You were more than happy to spend the money when the market was up. You gladly took the profits to fund your ridiculous country club lifestyle and buy your designer dresses. Do not pretend you are some innocent victim now. You are just as guilty as the rest of us." Barbara began weeping hysterically in her wheelchair, beating her frail fists against her own legs. "My reputation," she wailed over and over again, rocking violently back and forth. "My beautiful, flawless reputation in this city is gone. We are going to lose the house. We are going to lose the charity board seats. We are going to lose absolutely everything we have ever built." I slowly sat back down in the uncomfortable vinyl hospital chair. I smoothed the torn fabric of my custom wedding dress over my knees. I crossed my legs and rested my hands gracefully in my lap. I did not say a single word. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to defend myself anymore. I simply sat there, cold and entirely composed, watching the villains of my story completely tear each other apart. The man who had stood at an altar and promised to love me just hours ago was currently screaming vile profanities at his own sister. The woman who had tried to brutally poison my mind to steal my inheritance was sobbing uncontrollably over her lost social status. The sister who had tried to blackmail her husband into bankruptcy was weeping on the floor, surrounded by worthless, fraudulent legal papers. The entire room had descended into a violent, chaotic finger-pointing brawl. They were drowning in a sea of their own toxic creation, and there was absolutely no one left to throw them a lifeline. Every single vicious insult they hurled at each other was a profound, undeniable validation of my survival. They had looked at me and seen a weak, vulnerable orphan. They had seen a girl who was so incredibly desperate for family, for love, and for basic belonging that she would blindly walk right into a slaughterhouse. They had drastically, fatally underestimated the quiet girls sitting at the edge of their lavish dining tables. They never realized that growing up with absolutely nothing teaches you exactly how to protect everything you finally earn. They never realized that an actuary does not just predict the future, she mathematically ensures it. I watched David grab his hair, pulling at the roots, pacing the floor like a trapped, terrified wrathful rat. He pointed at his mother, loudly blaming her for executing the poisoning plan poorly. He blamed Sarah for failing to secure Marcus's money. He blamed the economy. He blamed the private lenders. He blamed absolutely everyone in the room except himself. It was a pathetic display of ultimate cowardice. He was stripping away every single layer of the charming, sophisticated man I thought I had married, exposing the rotting, hollow coward underneath. I felt absolutely no heartbreak. I felt no lingering emotional attachment to the life I thought we were going to build together. I only felt a deep, clean surgical precision. I had successfully excised a lethal tumor from my life before it could spread and kill me. Attorney Collins was still pressed flat against the heavy wooden door, her eyes wide with unadulterated professional terror. She was watching her wealthiest, most prominent clients completely self-destruct, and she knew her own name was permanently tied to this catastrophic criminal failure. She looked at me silently, begging for mercy. She wanted me to let her slip out the door, to pretend she had never been involved in this nightmare. I offered her a slow, chilling smile. There would be absolutely no mercy tonight. There would only be raw, unadulterated justice. The screaming continued to escalate, filling the small room with a suffocating, toxic energy. Sarah grabbed the plastic water cup David had left on the table and hurled it at his head, splashing water across his ruined tuxedo. Barbara wailed even louder, her cries bouncing off the glass walls. Marcus stood quietly near the television screen, watching the absolute destruction with the exact same cold, analytical detachment that I felt. We were the only two sane people standing in a room full of absolute total madness. We had successfully fought a massive two-front war against a dynasty of professional predators, and we had completely dismantled them without ever throwing a single punch. I took a deep, slow breath of the stale hospital air. It tasted sweeter than the most expensive vintage champagne they had tried to use to break my mind. The glorious, untouchable Myers Empire was burning directly to the ground, and I was comfortably sitting back, completely safe from the flames, simply enjoying the heat. The hospital security personnel and the police officers in the main lobby would inevitably hear the shouting soon. The authorities would forcefully intervene. The federal auditors would begin their meticulous, devastating forensic work on Monday morning. The criminal charges for attempted poisoning and financial extortion were inevitable. But for right now, in this exact beautiful moment, I was granting myself the absolute luxury of simply watching the fire spread. The pack had turned on itself completely, unable to survive the blinding light of their own exposed lies. The screaming inside the hospital conference room had reached a deafening pitch when a sharp, heavy knock echoed against the wooden door. Before anyone could respond, the door pushed open and the entire dynamic of the room shifted with the brutal weight of absolute reality. The two Chicago police officers, whom David had so arrogantly manipulated just an hour earlier, stepped into the room. Their demeanor was entirely different now. The sympathetic smiles were completely gone, replaced by the cold, hard expressions of law enforcement officers who realized they had been lied to. David froze mid-sentence, his hand still raised in a furious gesture toward his sister. Barbara stopped her hysterical wailing, her eyes widening in fresh, unadulterated panic. Marcus stepped forward, breaking the tense silence. He walked toward the officers with the calm, measured authority of a man who had orchestrated this exact moment. He had not just pulled the security footage from the hotel. While David was busy hunting down a corrupt legal notary, Marcus had quietly coordinated with the hospital security and these specific officers, presenting them with the initial digital evidence before they even set foot in this room. One of the officers stepped forward, holding a printed copy of Barbara's official toxicology report in one hand and Marcus's silver flash drive in the other. David immediately tried to revert to his wealthy, charismatic persona. He smoothed down his ruined tuxedo jacket and took a step toward the police, holding up his hands in a gesture of false surrender. "Officers, There is a massive misunderstanding here. He began, his voice dripping with forced polite charm. This is a private family dispute regarding my mother's medical care. We are handling it internally. The lead officer did not even blink. He looked David dead in the eyes and completely shut him down. There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Myers. The officer stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. We have the definitive toxicology report from the attending emergency room physician. We also have high-definition video evidence clearly showing your mother introducing a dangerous chemical substance into another person's beverage. That is not a family dispute. That is a major felony. The second officer walked directly toward Barbara. She shrank back into her hospital wheelchair, clutching the thin gray blanket around her ruined silk dress, as if it could somehow protect her from the consequences of her own actions. Barbara Myers, you are under arrest for aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and the intentional poisoning of Jessica Myers, the officer announced, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. Barbara let out a piercing shriek of absolute horror. You cannot arrest me, she cried out, kicking her feet against the wheelchair rests. I am a prominent member of Chicago society. I sit on the board of the City Hospital Foundation. You do not know who you are dealing with. I will have your badges for this. I demand to call my private attorneys immediately. The officer remained completely unfazed by her pathetic, desperate threats. He firmly grasped her arms, pulling them behind her back. The metallic click of the handcuffs locking around the wrists of the wealthy, untouchable matriarch was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. You can make all the phone calls you want from the precinct. Mrs. Myers, the officer replied dryly, securing the restraints. But right now, you are going into police custody. David watched his mother being handcuffed in absolute stunned silence. His entire world was collapsing, and his primary instinct was still pure cowardly self-preservation. He backed away from the wheelchair, raising his hands and shaking his head. I had nothing to do with this, he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. She acted completely alone. I am the victim here too. She ruined my wedding day. The lead officer turned his attention directly to David, stepping into his personal space. Save it for the judge, David, he commanded sternly. We have already received preliminary communication from the federal authorities regarding a massive data dump of your fraudulent financial ledgers, based on the overwhelming evidence of your commercial real estate debt and the highly suspicious power of attorney document sitting right there on that table. You are being detained for active conspiracy and suspected massive financial fraud. David's legs gave out completely. He collapsed backward into a vinyl waiting chair, his face burying into his hands as a raw, ugly sob tore through his throat. The arrogant predator who had planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward and drain my $5 million trust fund was now reduced to a weeping, trembling mess, facing a lengthy federal prison sentence. I walked slowly toward him. The heavy layers of my torn wedding gown rustled softly against the linoleum floor. I stood over him, looking down at the man who had promised to love and protect me just hours ago. He looked up at me, his eyes red and pathetic, silently begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I did not yell. I did not scream. I did not waste another ounce of my emotional energy on him. I reached down and grabbed his left hand. I felt him flinch, expecting violence. Instead, I simply slid the heavy diamond engagement ring and the platinum wedding band off my left ring finger. The metal felt cold and utterly meaningless in my palm. I dropped the rings directly into his lap. They landed with a soft, hollow thud against his wrinkled tuxedo pants. Keep them, David, I said, my voice dropping to a cold surgical whisper that only he could hear. You are going to need the cash to pay your defense attorneys. I will have my lawyers file the annulment papers first thing Monday morning. By the time you post bail, you will not even be a footnote in my life. I turned my back on him completely, severing the absolute final tie to the Myers family. I walked over to Marcus, who was standing near the door, watching the scene with quiet, profound respect. He offered me a small, supportive smile. Sarah was huddled in the corner of the room, entirely silent, her face buried in her hands, realizing she was completely alone and financially ruined. Attorney Collins was already being questioned by the officers, her corrupt legal career effectively ending right there in the hospital lobby. Are you ready to go? Marcus asked, offering his arm. I am ready, I replied, taking his arm and letting him guide me out of the suffocating conference room. We walked out of the emergency department, leaving the screaming, the crying, and the total destruction of the Myers dynasty far behind us. The automatic glass doors of Chicago Memorial Hospital slid open with a gentle hiss, welcoming us into the dark night. The violent rainstorm had finally stopped. The cool, crisp Chicago night air washed over my face, feeling incredibly clean and purifying. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the absolute intoxicating sensation of pure, unfiltered freedom. We stood on the wet pavement, looking out at the city skyline glowing against the dark clouds. We had walked into a meticulously designed slaughterhouse, and we had walked out as the sole survivors. Marcus had protected his life savings and formally severed himself from a toxic, abusive marriage. I had protected my mind, my autonomy, and my entire inheritance. We had faced an entire family of wealthy, arrogant predators, and we had completely dismantled them, using nothing but our intellect, our courage, and the unbreakable boundaries we refused to compromise. I looked up at the stars peeking through the breaking clouds, knowing my future was entirely my own. My trust fund was secure. My career was waiting for me. And I had gained a lifelong friend in Marcus, who understood exactly what it meant to fight for the truth when everyone else demanded your silence. If you are watching this, and you have ever been the target of toxic, manipulative people who wanted to tear you down to elevate themselves, I want you to know something incredibly important. You do not have to accept their abuse. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into their twisted narratives. You have the absolute power to set unbreakable boundaries to protect your assets, your mind, and your spirit. When you finally stand up and refuse to be a victim, you will discover a strength inside yourself that no one can ever take away. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If my story gave you hope or courage, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these powerful moments together. I read every single comment, so please let me know down below where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Your support means absolutely everything to me. Stay strong, protect your peace, and always remember your worth. I will see you in the next story. The dust settled over Chicago, but the lessons of that night permanently altered my DNA. I have spent my entire adult life looking at complex spreadsheets, analyzing risk margins, and balancing corporate ledgers. Numbers do not lie, but people absolutely do. They will look you right in the eye, smile warmly, and promise you a lifetime of unwavering devotion, while secretly calculating the exact moment to cash out your entire existence. Growing up with absolutely nothing, bouncing from one crowded foster home to another, taught me a brutal but entirely necessary truth. You have to be the solitary architect of your own survival. When you have no family safety net to catch your fall, you learn to see the fraying ropes long before they completely snap. I used to think my constant hypervigilance was a tragic trauma response. I thought it was a deep psychological flaw I needed to fix so I could finally fit into a normal, loving family. But David and his mother taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. My vigilance was never a flaw. It was my absolute greatest superpower. Trust is not a default setting. It is not a magical guarantee that comes automatically with a sparkling diamond ring, an expensive marriage certificate, or a shared prestigious last name. Trust is a highly valuable currency that must be consistently earned and rigorously audited every single day. In the weeks following that explosive hospital confrontation, the entire Myers family collapsed completely under the crushing weight of their own staggering arrogance. The federal financial authorities tore relentlessly through their hidden records, uncovering massive layers of commercial fraud, extreme tax evasion, and illegal predatory lending schemes that went far beyond what Marcus and I had originally discovered in that stairwell. Barbara was sentenced to a lengthy and brutal term in a federal penitentiary for the intentional poisoning and her central role in the financial conspiracy. Her pristine, untouchable high society reputation was instantly reduced to a sensationalized cautionary tale in the local tabloids. David received an even harsher sentence. His desperate, cowardly attempts to throw his own mother and sister under the bus backfired spectacularly, leaving him completely isolated, entirely bankrupt, and securely locked away in a federal facility for a very long time. Sarah lost absolutely everything in the resulting public fallout. Her exclusive country club memberships, her lavish designer wardrobe, and her entire elite social standing evaporated literally overnight. The bank aggressively foreclosed on the sprawling family estate, and the Myers name became absolutely toxic in every single Chicago real estate circle. My annulment was finalized incredibly quickly and quietly. I walked away from that brief, terrifying nightmare with my $5 million trust fund entirely intact, and my mind sharper and colder than ever before. But I did not just walk away and hide. I took that trauma and I built something powerful. Marcus and I realized we shared a highly unique and formidable combination of professional skills. He had the brilliant forensic financial expertise, and I had the precise actuarial risk assessment background. Together, we opened a private consulting firm specifically dedicated to helping women who find themselves trapped in financially abusive and highly manipulative marriages. We track their husbands' hidden assets. We untangle complex offshore accounts, and we build ironclad strategic exit plans for women whose partners try to use money as a weapon of total control. We teach them exactly how to read the ledgers, how to spot the hidden financial traps, and how to reclaim their complete independence. Justice is not just about watching the guilty get locked in cold steel handcuffs. True, absolute justice is about reclaiming your ultimate power and using your own survival to build a fortress that no predator can ever breach. Now, I want to turn this over to you, because I know I am not the only one who has ever faced a predator hiding behind a charming smile. I want to know if you have ever ignored a massive glaring red flag in a romantic relationship, because you wanted so desperately to believe the best about someone, only to find out your sharpest survival instincts were right all along. I wonder if you have ever felt that cold, twisting sensation in your gut, warning you that the person you trusted was entirely manipulating your reality. Tell me what you would have done if you were sitting at your own wedding reception and you saw someone secretly tampering with your drink. I want to know if you would have confronted them immediately in front of everyone, or if you would have played the long strategic game to secure your own escape. Let me know your honest thoughts and your own personal survival stories in the comments below, because reading your experiences constantly reminds me of how incredibly strong we all truly are when we are pushed to the absolute limit. If you love seeing toxic, manipulative people get completely outsmarted and brought to the absolute devastating justice they deserve, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button right now. It helps this community grow, and it helps these stories reach the people who might desperately need to hear them today. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, and absolutely do not forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a single story of survival and ultimate revenge. Before you go, drop a quick comment telling me exactly what state or what country you are currently watching this video from, and what the local time is there right now. It is always so incredibly amazing to see how far these stories travel, and to connect with this wonderful global community of strong, resilient survivors. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and for supporting this journey. Remember to always trust your gut, always protect your peace, and absolutely always protect your hard-earned assets. I will see you all in the very next video.